Independence Day, 2023. While America celebrates freedom with fireworks and barbecues, a billionaire CEO is celebrating something far darker: the carefully orchestrated murders of his own brothers. Landon Fletcher, a man whose name adorned hospital wings and university buildings across San Diego, stood in his mother's kitchen, running his fingers along a $4,000 bottle of champagne. But this wasn't just any celebration. Inside that bottle was death itself, a colorless, odorless neurotoxin he'd synthesized in his own laboratory just hours earlier. What drives a man to poison his own flesh and blood? Money? Power? Or something far more twisted? This is the story of one of America's most shocking family murders. A case where genius met evil, where brotherly love turned to calculated betrayal, and where one teenager's courage would bring down an empire built on lies. Welcome to the rise and fall of the Fletcher dynasty. Before we dive into this incredible true crime story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dive documentaries. If this story grips you, smash that like button and share it with anyone who loves true crime. Your support keeps these stories coming. Now let's get into it. San Diego, California, a city where golden beaches meet cutting-edge innovation, where billion-dollar biotech companies tower over the Pacific coastline, and where one family name seemed to define success itself: the Fletchers. If you lived in San Diego in the early 2020s, you couldn't escape that name. The Fletcher wing at the University Medical Center. The Fletcher Biotech headquarters gleaming in the downtown skyline. The Fletcher Foundation funding everything from cancer research to youth programs. They were royalty in a city that worshipped innovation and wealth. But behind the philanthropic facade, behind the press releases and charity galas, something dark was brewing. Something that would shatter this picture-perfect dynasty and reveal that even the most brilliant minds can harbor the most sinister intentions. Let me introduce you to the Fletcher brothers. First, there was Landon Whitmore Fletcher, 45 years old, the eldest son and CEO of Fletcher Biotech. Landon was what you might call a quintessential alpha male in the corporate world: brilliant, driven, and absolutely relentless. He held multiple patents in biochemistry, had turned his father's modest research company into a billion-dollar empire, and moved through San Diego's elite circles like he owned the place. Which, in many ways, he did. His Tom Ford suits were always immaculate, his handshake firm and calculated, his smile practiced to perfection. People who worked with Landon described him as intimidating but visionary, someone who could see 10 moves ahead in any business negotiation. But there was something else, something his employees whispered about in break rooms and over drinks after particularly brutal meetings. Landon Fletcher didn't just want to win, he needed to dominate. He needed to be the smartest person in every room, the most successful Fletcher, the one who would be remembered long after he was gone. That need, that obsessive hunger for control and recognition, would ultimately become the catalyst for unspeakable evil. Then there was Donovan Pierce Fletcher, 42, the middle brother and chief operating officer of Fletcher Biotech. If Landon was the brilliant but cold strategist, Donovan was the charismatic counterbalance, the people person who could charm investors, motivate employees, and make anyone feel valued in a 5-minute conversation. He had his father's warmth and his mother's emotional intelligence, qualities that made him beloved within the company and throughout San Diego's business community. Donovan was married with 2 young children, coached his son's little league team, and genuinely seemed to care about the human cost of corporate decisions. He was the kind of executive who remembered employees' names, asked about their families, and fought for ethical practices even when they cut into profit margins. In many ways, Donovan represented everything Landon resented: natural charisma, effortless likability, and the respect that came from genuine connection rather than intimidation. Their father had always favored Donovan, or at least that's how Landon perceived it, and that perceived slight had festered for decades, growing into something toxic and dangerous. Finally, there was Joshua Reed Fletcher, the youngest at 38, head of research and development. Joshua was the pure scientist of the family, more comfortable in a laboratory than a boardroom, more interested in molecular structures than market strategies. He'd earned his PhD in biochemistry from MIT, published groundbreaking papers on neurotoxin development for military applications, and held the kind of specialized knowledge that made Fletcher Biotech a leader in defense contracts. Joshua was recently engaged, planning a wedding for the following spring, and had been increasingly vocal about his concerns regarding some of the company's more ethically questionable projects. He believed science should serve humanity, not just profit margins or military applications without proper oversight. Like Donovan, Joshua had begun to question whether Landon's leadership was taking the company in a direction that compromised their father's original vision of innovation for the greater good. That questioning, that growing alliance between the two younger brothers, would sign their death warrants. The three brothers shared a complicated history, as most siblings do, but theirs was amplified by wealth, corporate power, and the pressure of living up to a family legacy built by their father, Richard Fletcher, who had founded the company in the 1980s. Richard had been a visionary in his own right, but also a demanding father who pitted his sons against each other, perhaps unintentionally creating the competitive dynamic that would eventually turn lethal. After Richard's death in 2019, the brothers had inherited equal shares in the family trust, with Landon assuming the CEO position based on his business acumen and oldest son status. But that arrangement came with a critical stipulation designed by their mother, Marissa Caldwell Fletcher. Any major decisions regarding succession or control of the company required unanimous agreement among all three brothers. It was supposed to be a safeguard, a way to ensure collaboration rather than corporate warfare. Instead, it became a powder keg waiting for a spark. And that spark came in June 2023, when Donovan discovered something that would change everything. As COO, Donovan had access to Fletcher Biotech's financial records, and what he found buried in the company's complex accounting systems made his blood run cold. For $100 million. That's how much Landon had embezzled over the previous 5 years through an elaborate network of shell companies, phantom research projects, and inflated defense contracts. The money had been systematically diverted from military funding meant for medical research and instead funneled into offshore accounts Landon controlled personally. It was brilliant in its complexity, the kind of financial engineering that required both genius-level intelligence and absolutely no moral compass. Donovan confronted Landon in late June, presenting the evidence he'd compiled and demanding immediate rectification. Landon's response was chilling in its casualness. He offered to cut Donovan in on the scheme, suggesting that $400 million could easily become $600 million if they worked together. When Donovan refused and threatened to file a whistleblower complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission, Landon's demeanor shifted. The mask of brotherly concern dropped, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You're making a mistake," Landon had said quietly. "You have no idea what you're starting." But Donovan wasn't alone in his concerns about Landon's leadership. Joshua had independently discovered troubling information about some of Fletcher Biotech's research programs, particularly the development of neurotoxins that seemed to have no legitimate medical application and violated multiple ethical guidelines. The younger brothers began meeting privately, comparing notes, and realizing that Landon had transformed their father's company into something darker than either had imagined. They made a decision that sealed their fate. They would vote together to remove Landon as CEO during the upcoming trust meeting, which was scheduled for mid-July, just after the Independence Day holiday. They would force accountability, restore ethical practices, and potentially cooperate with federal investigators regarding the embezzlement. It was the right thing to do, the moral choice, the decision that honored their father's legacy. It was also a death sentence. Here's where we need to understand something crucial about Landon Fletcher's psychology, because without understanding how his mind worked, the murders he was about to commit seem almost incomprehensible. Landon wasn't just a businessman or even just a criminal. He was a narcissist in the clinical sense, someone whose entire self-concept was built on being superior to everyone around him. Every slight, every comparison to his more likable brothers, every suggestion that he wasn't the undisputed leader of the family dynasty cut him like a knife. And in early 2023, Landon received news that amplified these psychological pressures to a breaking point. He was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 6 months, maybe a year with aggressive treatment. For most people, a terminal diagnosis triggers reflection, maybe regret, a desire to make peace with loved ones. For Landon, it triggered something entirely different, a desperate need to secure his legacy, to ensure he would be remembered as the great Fletcher, to eliminate any obstacles to his vision of family history. If he was going to die, he would die in complete control, with his enemies vanquished and his dominance unquestioned. So Landon began to plan. And here's what made him so dangerous. He had the perfect combination of expertise, resources, and sociopathic detachment to actually pull off what most people could only imagine in their darkest moments. He was a trained biochemist with access to one of the world's most advanced biotech laboratories. He understood molecular structures, toxicology, and how to create compounds that could kill efficiently while evading standard detection methods. He had the financial resources to cover his tracks, the social standing to deflect suspicion, and the arrogance to believe he could literally get away with murder. Over the course of several weeks in June 2023, Landon developed what he called Fletcher X-27, a proprietary neurotoxin designed with one purpose: to kill his brothers while making their deaths appear natural or at least accidental. The compound was colorless, odorless, and specifically engineered to degrade rapidly after death, making toxicology detection nearly impossible with standard autopsy procedures. It was, in its own horrifying way, a masterpiece of applied biochemistry. Landon even took photographs of the synthesis process, documenting his work with the twisted pride of an artist creating his magnum opus. The plan came together with the same meticulous attention to detail Landon applied to corporate acquisitions. The Fletcher family had a tradition of gathering at their mother's estate in the Hamptons for major holidays, and Independence Day 2023 seemed like the perfect opportunity. Marissa Fletcher, the family matriarch, was in the advanced stages of terminal cancer herself, and she'd specifically requested one last family gathering, hoping to see her sons together before her illness progressed further. The irony would later strike investigators as almost unbearably cruel. A dying mother's plea for family unity would become the setting for fratricide. Landon would bring a bottle of exceptionally expensive champagne, something appropriate for what Marissa believed would be a celebration of family and shared memories. He would use his custom monogrammed corkscrew, the one with his initials LWF that he'd received as a gift years earlier and always carried with him as a symbol of sophistication and status. He would introduce the Fletcher X-27 into the champagne, offer toasts to family and legacy, and watch as his brothers consumed their own deaths while trusting him completely. It was personal, it was symbolic, and it was absolutely evil in its intimacy. As July 4th approached, Landon made his final preparations. He accessed Fletcher Biotech's most secure laboratory at 2:13 in the morning on July 3rd, spending 47 minutes in the synthesis chamber creating the exact dosage of Fletcher X-27 needed to kill 2 adult men within an hour of consumption. Security footage would later show him leaving the facility with a small vial, his expression calm and focused, a man executing a business plan rather than preparing for double murder. He selected the champagne carefully, a bottle of Dom Perignon that cost $4,000, because even in murder, Landon needed to demonstrate his superior taste and resources. And he made one critical error, though he wouldn't realize it until much later. In documenting his plan, creating a detailed timeline and chemical formula for his own records, Landon had saved everything to a cloud storage account. It was a secure account, or so he thought, but through a technical mistake he'd accidentally set the sharing permissions to include his daughter Sterling's account. That mistake, that single moment of carelessness in an otherwise meticulous plan, would ultimately unravel everything. But on July 3rd, as Landon drove from San Diego to the Hamptons with a bottle of poisoned champagne in his luggage and murder in his heart, he believed himself untouchable. He believed he'd created the perfect crime, executed with scientific precision by a mind too brilliant for conventional justice. He was about to learn that even genius has its blind spots, and that the daughter he claimed to love might possess something he'd never understood: a conscience. The Fletcher estate in the Hamptons was exactly what you'd expect from a family worth billions: sprawling, elegant, and dripping with old money sophistication. The main house sat on 3 acres of manicured lawns that rolled gently down toward the Atlantic Ocean, with floor-to-ceiling windows that captured every sunset in breathtaking detail. Inside, the great room featured crystal chandeliers imported from Vienna, Italian marble floors that had been installed by craftsmen flown in specifically for the project, and art that would make museum curators weep with envy. This was where the Fletcher family had gathered for decades to celebrate holidays, mark milestones, and maintain the illusion of unity that wealthy families often mistake for actual connection. On July 4th, 2023, as fireworks preparation began in towns across America, the surviving members of the Fletcher family assembled for what Marissa believed would be one final celebration before her cancer made such gatherings impossible. She had no idea she was setting the stage for her son's murders. Landon arrived first, punctual as always, carrying his expensive luggage and that $4,000 bottle of Dom Perignon. He greeted his mother with practiced warmth, kissing her cheek and asking about her health with what seemed like genuine concern. Marissa, at 68 years old and visibly weakened by her illness, was nonetheless sharp-eyed and observant. She noticed the slight tension in Landon's shoulders, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, but she attributed it to stress from running the company or perhaps his own recent cancer diagnosis, which he'd shared with the family just weeks earlier. She couldn't have known that her eldest son had spent the previous night synthesizing a lethal neurotoxin, or that the champagne he placed carefully in the wine cellar contained enough poison to kill his brothers within the hour. Landon moved through the house with the confidence of someone who belonged there, someone who'd spent countless childhood summers running through these same rooms. But now his movements had a different quality, measured, deliberate, purposeful. He was mentally rehearsing the evening ahead, running through every detail of his plan, making sure nothing was left to chance. Donovan arrived about an hour later with his wife Catherine and their 2 children, and the contrast between the brothers was immediately apparent to anyone paying attention. Where Landon was controlled and composed, Donovan was warm and animated, scooping up his mother in a gentle hug and entertaining his kids with exaggerated stories about growing up in this house. But beneath that cheerful exterior, Donovan carried the weight of what he knew. The embezzlement, the whistleblower report sitting on his secure laptop upstairs, and the confrontation that was coming after the holiday weekend. He'd brought the evidence with him, planning to present it to Joshua during a private conversation, solidifying their alliance before the trust meeting that would remove Landon from power. Donovan had even practiced what he'd say, how he'd frame it not as betrayal, but as necessary intervention to save the company their father had built. He'd convinced himself that Landon would ultimately understand that some part of his older brother still valued family over pride. That hope would prove tragically misplaced. Joshua was the last to arrive, pulling up in his sensible sedan around 3 in the afternoon, looking slightly disheveled from the drive and carrying a bouquet of flowers for his mother. The youngest Fletcher brother had always been the most earnest of the 3, the one who still believed in doing the right thing even when it was difficult or costly. His fiancée Maria was supposed to join them, but had been called away for a family emergency, a stroke of luck that would save her life, though Joshua would never know it. As he entered the great room where his brothers and mother had gathered, Joshua felt the familiar mixture of affection and unease that family gatherings always triggered. He loved his brothers, or at least he loved who they used to be before money and power had complicated everything. He caught Donovan's eye and received a small nod. They would talk later, solidify their plans, and together they would steer Fletcher Biotech back toward ethical research and transparency. Joshua had no idea that his brother Landon was already mentally calculating dosages and timing, treating this family gathering like a military operation that required precision execution. Also present that afternoon was Sterling Fletcher, Landon's 19-year-old daughter, home from her sophomore year at Stanford and already showing signs of the fierce independence that would later make her a hero in this story. Sterling had her father's intelligence, but thankfully none of his moral bankruptcy. And over the past year, she'd been increasingly troubled by his behavior. The controlling nature, the angry outbursts when things didn't go his way, the way he talked about her uncles with barely concealed contempt. She'd been fighting with Landon about her desire to use part of her trust fund to establish a foundation for addiction recovery services, something he'd dismissed as naive idealism that would waste resources better invested in Fletcher Biotech. Their relationship had grown strained, but Sterling still loved her father, still wanted to believe that beneath the corporate ruthlessness was someone who cared about more than just winning. That belief would be shattered in the coming hours. Landon's ex-wife Victoria was also there, maintaining the polite distance that divorced couples manage at family functions, her instinct for self-preservation having long ago taught her to be wary of anything Landon offered, a caution that would save her life when she declined the champagne toast. As evening approached and the sun began its descent toward the Atlantic horizon, Landon made his move. He excused himself from the group conversation about politics and business trends, heading down to the wine cellar with the stated intention of selecting something special for dinner. This was the moment he'd been planning for weeks, the point of no return in his carefully orchestrated crime. The wine cellar was temperature-controlled, extensive, and most importantly, private. Landon located the Dom Perignon he'd placed there earlier, along with his monogrammed corkscrew that he'd brought specifically for this purpose. With hands that were steady despite what he was about to do, Landon carefully removed the cork, using the distinctive LWF corkscrew that would later become crucial evidence linking him to the murder method. He produced the small vial of Fletcher X-27 from his pocket, colorless, odorless, and absolutely lethal, and measured exactly the right amount into the champagne bottle. The neurotoxin was designed to activate upon consumption, beginning its work immediately, but showing symptoms only after sufficient time had passed to make pinpointing the source nearly impossible. Landon had calculated everything: the dosage needed for 2 adult men of his brother's approximate weights, the timeline from consumption to symptom onset, even the degradation rate that would make toxicology detection difficult unless investigators knew exactly what to look for. After carefully recorking the bottle and wiping away any fingerprints from the vial, which he'd dispose of later, Landon returned to the great room, carrying the champagne like a prize. His performance was flawless, the proud son offering something special for his dying mother's potentially final family gathering. The successful CEO, who could afford $4,000 bottles without thinking twice. The loving brother who wanted to toast to family bonds and shared memories. "I thought we should have something exceptional tonight," Landon announced to the assembled family, his voice carrying that practiced warmth that had fooled investors and board members for years. "Mom wanted us all together, and who knows when we'll have another chance like this." The statement carried a double meaning that only he understood. This would indeed be the last time these particular family members would be together, though not for the reasons anyone else imagined. Marissa smiled from her position near the fireplace, touched by what she perceived as her eldest son's sentimentality, completely unaware that she was watching the prelude to a double murder. Landon opened the champagne with ceremonial flair, the pop of the cork echoing in the great room as he began pouring into crystal flutes that had been in the Fletcher family for 3 generations. Here's where his planning became even more diabolical. He brought his own bottle of actual, unpoisoned champagne that he discreetly poured for himself, a detail that would later become crucial evidence when investigators tried to understand how Landon could participate in the toast without poisoning himself. He distributed the glasses with careful precision, making sure Donovan and Joshua each received generous portions from the poison bottle while offering smaller amounts to others present. When Marissa declined due to her medication, and Victoria waved off the champagne in favor of sparkling water, Landon showed no visible disappointment. They weren't the targets anyway. His focus was entirely on his brothers, watching to make sure they each took their glasses, waiting for the moment when they would seal their own fates. "A toast," Landon said, raising his glass and commanding the room's attention with the same authoritative presence that made him effective in boardrooms. "To family, to Mom's strength through everything she's facing, and to the Fletcher legacy that Dad built and that we continue to honor." It was perfectly pitched, sentimental enough to seem genuine, general enough to avoid suspicion, and absolutely hollow coming from a man who'd just poisoned 2 of the people he was toasting. Donovan and Joshua raised their glasses without hesitation, trusting their brother completely, seeing this as a rare moment of family unity in what had become an increasingly fractured relationship. Sterling watched from the side, noticing something she couldn't quite articulate: a tension in her father's jaw, a slight tremor in his hand that betrayed the weight of what he was orchestrating, but she dismissed it as stress or perhaps emotion about his mother's illness. She had no framework for understanding what was actually happening, no way to comprehend that her father was capable of such calculated evil. They drank. Donovan took a substantial sip, appreciating the quality of the champagne and commenting on its exceptional taste. Joshua, less interested in expensive alcohol but not wanting to appear rude, drank deeply as well, already thinking ahead to the private conversation he and Donovan would have later that evening about their plans for the company. The Fletcher X-27 entered their system smoothly, its colorless and odorless properties making it completely undetectable as it began its deadly work. The neurotoxin had been specifically designed to cross the blood-brain barrier rapidly, targeting neural pathways and systematically shutting down voluntary muscle control while leaving consciousness intact for as long as possible. A particularly cruel feature that Landon had incorporated either through indifference to suffering or perhaps even deliberate malice. For the next 40 minutes, everything seemed normal. The family continued their conversation, discussing Sterling's plans for her foundation, Marissa's upcoming medical appointments, and even some light-hearted reminiscing about childhood summers at the estate. Landon participated in all of it with apparent ease, the consummate performer playing his role while internally monitoring his brothers for the first signs of the poison taking effect. Joshua was the first to show symptoms, around 38 minutes after the toast. It started subtly, a slight disorientation that he laughed off as the champagne affecting him more than usual, followed by a tingling sensation in his extremities that he attributed to sitting in an awkward position. "I think the Dom Perignon is stronger than I'm used to," he joked, smiling at his mother while internally starting to feel genuine concern about the odd sensations spreading through his body. Marissa suggested he sit down, perhaps get some water, maternal concern overriding any suspicion that something sinister was occurring. Donovan, watching his younger brother with growing alarm, began to feel his own symptoms emerging, a tightness in his chest, difficulty drawing a full breath, and a creeping numbness that seemed to be moving from his fingers up his arms. The brothers' eyes met across the room, and in that moment, some terrible understanding passed between them, though neither yet grasped the full horror of what was happening. They'd been poisoned, but by whom? By what? And most horrifically, why? The next few minutes descended into chaos as both brothers' conditions deteriorated rapidly. Joshua collapsed first, his legs giving out as the neurotoxin shut down the neural pathways controlling his voluntary movements. Marissa screamed for someone to call 911 while Donovan, fighting against his own failing body, tried to reach his brother's side before he too clutched at his chest, his face contorted in confusion and terror as he realized his body was shutting down. Sterling rushed to grab her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed emergency services, her mind unable to process what she was witnessing. Victoria backed away instinctively, some primal part of her recognizing danger even if she couldn't identify its source. And Landon? Landon performed the role of devastated brother with Academy Award-worthy skill. He dropped to his knees beside Donovan, calling his name with apparent desperation, checking for a pulse with hands that had synthesized the poison killing him. He shouted medical terms and instructions to Sterling, creating the impression of someone desperately trying to help even as he subtly ensured that no intervention could possibly succeed in time. His call to 911 was appropriately panicked, his voice breaking in all the right places, his description of symptoms carefully vague to prevent early diagnosis of poisoning. By the time paramedics arrived 14 minutes later, both Donovan and Joshua Fletcher were beyond saving. Their bodies had already begun to cool on the Italian marble floor, their eyes fixed and dilated, their final moments having been spent in confusion and terror as they suffocated from neural paralysis while consciousness remained. The Fletcher X-27 had done exactly what Landon designed it to do: kill efficiently, violently, and with just enough ambiguity to make the cause of death unclear in the crucial first hours. The paramedics worked frantically, attempting resuscitation protocols even though it was obviously too late, their efforts more for the benefit of the traumatized family members than from any real hope of revival. Landon maintained his performance throughout. The grieving brother who'd watched helplessly as some mysterious malady claimed his siblings, the concerned son comforting his mother as she collapsed with grief, the take-charge CEO already making arrangements for the bodies to be transported back to San Diego where, he insisted, the best medical facilities could determine what had happened. That insistence on San Diego would later strike investigators as suspicious. Why not allow the local medical examiner in New York to handle the case? But in the moment, overwhelmed by tragedy and chaos, no one questioned Landon Fletcher's decisions. He was, after all, the surviving brother, the one who needed to take charge of an impossible situation. And he played that role perfectly, never breaking character even as his mother sobbed against his shoulder, even as Sterling stared at her dead uncles with horror-struck eyes. even as Victoria watched him with an expression that mixed sympathy with something that might have been suspicion. Outside, Independence Day fireworks began to explode across the Hamptons skyline, their celebration a grotesque soundtrack to the tragedy unfolding inside the Fletcher estate. America was celebrating freedom while Landon Fletcher had just committed one of the most calculated murders the country would see that decade, and he believed he'd gotten away with it perfectly. Detective Sarah Chun had worked homicide for the San Diego Police Department for 15 years, long enough to develop an instinct about death that went beyond evidence and procedure. When her phone rang at 7 in the morning on July 6, 2023, 2 days after the Fletcher brothers' deaths, she was drinking her second coffee and reviewing case files from an unrelated investigation. The medical examiner's office needed her downtown immediately. Something about the Fletcher Biotech executives who died in New York had raised red flags during the preliminary toxicology work. Sarah knew the Fletcher name, of course. Everyone in San Diego knew that name. The company employed thousands, contributed millions to local charities, and represented the kind of success story that made the city proud. The idea that their deaths might be anything other than tragic natural causes seemed almost impossible. But Sarah had learned long ago that wealth and status didn't prevent murder. If anything, they often motivated it. The San Diego Medical Examiner's office was located in a nondescript building that most residents drove past without noticing, which was probably intentional given the nature of work performed inside. Dr. Melissa Werner met Sarah in the main examination room, where Donovan and Joshua Fletcher's bodies lay on adjacent steel tables, their physical forms still imposing even in death. "I've been doing this for 23 years, Dr. Werner said without preamble, her German accent still thick despite decades in California. "And I've never seen tissue degradation patterns like this." The preliminary tox screen showed anomalies that don't match any known poison in our reference database, and the timing of death, both men within minutes of each other, is statistically improbable if we're talking about natural causes or even accidental poisoning. Sarah moved closer to examine the bodies, noting the absence of visible trauma, no injection marks, no signs of struggle, nothing that immediately suggested violence. Whatever killed these men had been invisible, which meant it was either incredibly sophisticated or they were missing something obvious. Dr. Werner pulled up digital images showing microscopic views of tissue samples, pointing to cellular damage that indicated exposure to some form of synthetic neurotoxin, something that targeted specific neural pathways with precision that suggested design rather than natural occurrence. "You're telling me this was murder," Sarah said. The statement not really a question because she could see where the evidence was pointing even if she didn't want to believe it. Two prominent businessmen didn't just simultaneously drop dead from some unknown compound, unless someone had deliberately introduced that compound into their systems. Dr. Werner nodded, explaining that she'd already sent samples to a specialized laboratory that dealt with rare toxins and chemical weapons, hoping they might identify the specific compound. But even without confirmation, the patterns were clear. This was poisoning, and it was sophisticated enough that whoever did it had significant knowledge of biochemistry and access to either research facilities or black market chemical suppliers. Sarah began forming her investigative strategy even as Dr. Werner continued explaining the medical findings. First priority was establishing a timeline. When and where had the brothers been exposed to this toxin? Second was victimology. Who wanted them dead and why? Third was means and opportunity. Who had the capability to synthesize or acquire such a sophisticated poison? Back at police headquarters, Sarah began constructing her case board, a ritual she performed for every major investigation, surrounding herself with photographs, documents, and timeline notations that would help her see patterns and connections. She pinned photos of Donovan and Joshua Fletcher at the top, successful men in their prime, beloved by their colleagues and families, with no obvious enemies and everything to live for. Below them, she added the initial autopsy findings, the toxicology anomalies, and witness statements from family members who'd been present at the Hamptons estate during the deaths. And then, because she always followed the money and power in cases like this, Sarah added a third photograph. Landon Whitmore Fletcher, the surviving brother who now stood to inherit complete control of Fletcher Biotech, a billion-dollar company that had been on the verge of a major leadership transition. The timing was suspicious enough to make Landon an immediate person of interest, though Sarah knew that suspicion and evidence were very different things, especially when your suspect was one of San Diego's most powerful citizens. Sarah's first real break came that afternoon when the specialized laboratory called with preliminary identification of the toxin. "We've got a partial match to a class of experimental neurotoxins being developed for military applications," the lab director explained, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd solved a particularly difficult puzzle. "The compound shows characteristics of cutting-edge biotech research, specifically the kind of work done by defense contractors working on incapacitating agents. What's interesting is that this particular molecular structure includes proprietary modifications that aren't in any published research we can find. Whoever created this essentially invented a new neurotoxin, which means we're looking at someone with advanced knowledge of biochemistry and access to sophisticated laboratory equipment." Sarah felt that familiar tingle of a case beginning to break open. She was looking for someone with very specific credentials, and there were only so many people in San Diego with those qualifications. Fletcher Biotech held multiple defense contracts for neurotoxin research, and their CEO had a PhD in biochemistry with multiple patents in molecular synthesis. The circumstantial case against Landon Fletcher was building, but Sarah needed more than circumstance if she was going to move against someone with his resources and connections. The detective began pulling records on Fletcher Biotech's research facilities, specifically their secure laboratories where classified work was conducted. She filed requests for security access logs, chemical inventory records, and any documentation of research into neurotoxic compounds. The company's legal team responded with predictable resistance, citing proprietary research protection and national security concerns, but Sarah had anticipated this and already had her department's legal counsel working on warrants that would compel production of those records. While she waited for the legal process to grind forward, Sarah began interviewing people who'd been present at the Hamptons estate on July 4th, starting with Sterling Fletcher, who'd been the one to call 911. The 19-year-old met Sarah at a coffee shop in La Jolla, looking exhausted and traumatized, her eyes carrying the haunted look of someone who'd witnessed something terrible and couldn't unsee it. "Walk me through everything you remember about that evening," Sarah said gently, recognizing that Sterling was grieving and potentially traumatized, but also knowing that witnesses closest to violent death often held crucial details they didn't realize were significant. Sterling described the gathering in detail, her grandmother's desire for one last family celebration, the relatively cheerful atmosphere before everything went wrong, and the champagne toast that had preceded her uncle's collapse by about 40 minutes. "Did you notice anything unusual about the champagne or how it was served?" Sarah asked, watching Sterling's face carefully for micro-expressions that might indicate she was holding something back. Sterling frowned, thinking, then mentioned something that made Sarah's instincts fire. Her father had brought his own bottle, something expensive that he'd made a point of opening himself using his monogrammed corkscrew, the one he always carried and was almost precious about. "He poured from that bottle for Uncle Donovan and Uncle Joshua, but I think he drank from a different bottle," Sterling said slowly, the memory crystallizing as she spoke. "I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now that I'm remembering, yeah, he definitely had a separate glass from a different bottle." That detail transformed Sarah's investigation from suspicion to active pursuit. If Landon had served poisoned champagne to his brothers while drinking from an unpoisoned bottle himself, that demonstrated not just opportunity, but premeditation and consciousness of guilt. Sarah immediately asked about the location of the champagne bottle and glasses, learning that they'd been preserved by the estate's housekeeper who'd thought they might be important and had stored them in a secure pantry rather than washing them, as she normally would have. Sarah arranged for those items to be secured as evidence and transported to the San Diego forensics lab, knowing that if she could find traces of the neurotoxin in those glasses, she'd have her murder weapon. She also asked Sterling about family dynamics, the relationship between the brothers, and whether there'd been any recent conflicts or tensions. Sterling hesitated before answering, clearly wrestling with loyalty to her father versus honesty with someone investigating her uncle's deaths. And in that hesitation, Sarah saw the internal conflict of someone who suspected but didn't want to believe. "My dad and my uncles had been fighting about the company," Sterling finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it aloud made it too real. "Uncle Donovan found some financial irregularities, and he and Uncle Joshua were planning to vote to remove my dad as CEO. They were going to file some kind of report with the government about money being misused. My dad was furious when Uncle Donovan confronted him about it, and they had a huge argument a few weeks ago. But that doesn't mean. She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought that her father might have murdered his brothers to prevent that vote and protect his position. Sarah thanked Sterling for her honesty and promised to keep her updated on the investigation. Recognizing that this young woman was caught between family loyalty and justice, a position no one should have to navigate. As Sterling left the coffee shop, Sarah added another layer to her developing theory. Landon Fletcher had motive beyond just corporate control. He was protecting himself from criminal exposure for embezzlement, which meant he was facing not just loss of position, but potential prison time if his brothers succeeded in their whistleblower plans. The next crucial break came from an unexpected source, the housekeeper at the Hamptons estate who'd preserved the champagne evidence. During a phone interview, she mentioned that Mr. Landon's special corkscrew, the monogrammed one with his initials that he never let anyone else use, had been missing from its usual storage location in the butler's pantry. He always keeps it in the same drawer when he visits, she explained. But after that terrible night, it wasn't there. I thought maybe he'd taken it back to California with him, but it seemed odd because he usually leaves it here for the next visit. Sarah immediately understood the significance. If Landon had used that corkscrew to open the poisoned champagne and then taken it with him rather than leaving it at the estate, that suggested consciousness of guilt and an attempt to control evidence. She obtained a warrant to search Landon's San Diego residences for the corkscrew, suspecting it might contain microscopic traces of both the cork and the neurotoxin that could link him directly to the murder method. While warrants were being processed and evidence was being analyzed, Sarah dove into Fletcher Biotech security systems, looking for any indication that Landon had accessed research facilities around the time of the murders. What she found was damning. Security logs showed Landon Fletcher entering the company's most restricted laboratory at 2:13 a.m. on July 4th, just hours before the family gathering in the Hamptons. The facility was designated as a synthesis chamber, used for creating experimental compounds that required high security clearance and careful documentation. Landon had been in that room for 47 minutes in the middle of the night when the building was otherwise virtually empty. When Sarah cross-referenced this with flight records, she discovered that Landon had flown on his private jet from San Diego to the Hamptons later that same day, arriving just in time for the evening gathering where his brothers would die. The timeline was devastating to any innocent explanation. Lab access in the middle of the night, immediate travel to where the victims would be, deaths occurring within hours of arrival, and then immediate return to San Diego the following day after ensuring the bodies would be transported to San Diego's medical examiner rather than being examined in New York. Sarah compiled all of this information into a detailed briefing for the district attorney's office, knowing that she was building a case against one of the city's most prominent citizens and would need ironclad evidence to proceed. District Attorney Olivia Rodriguez reviewed the findings with a critical eye, recognizing both the strength of the circumstantial case and the challenges they'd face prosecuting someone with Landon Fletcher's resources. "We need the murder weapon," Olivia said finally, referring to the champagne bottle and glasses that were currently being analyzed by forensics. "We need that corkscrew with traces linking it to the poison. And ideally, we need some kind of documentation that he planned this, because a defense attorney worth their retainer will argue coincidence and circumstance all the way through trial." Sarah agreed, but felt confident that the evidence was out there waiting to be found. Someone as meticulous as Landon Fletcher would have documented his work, if only because that's what scientists did. They recorded, they measured, they preserved their methodology. The question was where those records might be hidden. The forensics lab came through 3 days later with results that would become central to the prosecution's case. The champagne glasses that had been preserved by the housekeeper showed clear traces of the same neurotoxin compound found in the victim's systems, confirming that the champagne had been the delivery method. The bottle itself showed evidence of tampering. The cork had been removed and replaced before serving, detectable through microscopic analysis of the cork's structure and the bottle's seal. And most importantly, when investigators located the monogrammed corkscrew in Landon's San Diego penthouse rather than at the Hamptons estate where it belonged, forensic analysis revealed microscopic traces of both the champagne cork and the neurotoxin compound. The tool marks on the cork matched the corkscrew's unique were patterned perfectly, creating an unbreakable physical link between Landon Fletcher, the murder weapon, and the method of poison delivery. Sarah had her case, but she was about to receive one more piece of evidence that would transform it from strong to overwhelming. On July 8th, an anonymous tip came through the police department's secure online portal. The message was brief but specific. Check Landon Fletcher's cloud storage account for evidence of premeditation. Access information attached. The tip included login credentials for a cloud storage service, and when Sarah's cybercrime team accessed the account, they found something that made even hardened investigators pause in shock: a detailed document titled D&J Elimination Timeline that laid out step-by-step plans for murdering Donovan and Joshua Fletcher. The document included the chemical formula for Fletcher X-27, notes on its synthesis and expected effects, diagrams of the Hamptons estate showing positioning during the toast, and even reminders about bringing the monogrammed corkscrew and ensuring no one else drank from the poison bottle. It was a murder manual written in Landon's distinctive technical style, complete with the kind of scientific precision that confirmed the toxicology reports and security footage analysis. Sarah would later learn that the anonymous tipster was Sterling Fletcher, who discovered the documents accidentally while accessing shared family cloud storage and made the agonizing decision to turn her father in rather than protect him. But in the moment, Sarah simply saw the final piece of evidence she needed to arrest one of San Diego's most powerful men for the calculated murder of his own brothers. On July 10th, Judge Eleanor Blackwood reviewed Sarah's warrant application and signed off on the arrest of Landon Whitmore Fletcher for 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. Sarah assembled her team carefully for the arrest, knowing that media attention would be intense and that any procedural error would be exploited by what would certainly be a high-powered defense team. They would move at dawn the following day, approaching Landon's downtown penthouse with overwhelming force to prevent any possibility of escape or evidence destruction. As Sarah reviewed the operational plan one final time, she found herself reflecting on the cold calculation evident in every aspect of this crime. A man who'd synthesized death for his own brothers, who'd looked them in the eye while serving them poison, who'd performed grief while watching them die. She'd seen many murderers in her career, but few had combined such technical expertise with such complete absence of remorse or human connection. Landon Fletcher represented something particularly disturbing: the intersection of genius and sociopathy, where brilliant minds capable of advancing human knowledge instead turned that brilliance toward destruction. Tomorrow morning, he would learn that wealth and position didn't place anyone above the law, and that even the most carefully planned murder could be unraveled by determined investigation and the courage of a daughter who chose justice over family loyalty. The morning light was just beginning to break over San Diego Bay when Detective Sarah Chen's team assembled in the parking garage beneath Landon Fletcher's luxury high-rise. The building was one of those glass and steel towers that defined downtown San Diego's skyline, all clean lines and expensive materials, the kind of place where a 2-bedroom condo started at $3 million and the penthouse, where Landon Fletcher lived, occupied the entire top floor at a price that most San Diego residents couldn't fathom. Sarah had briefed her team thoroughly the night before, emphasizing the need for perfect execution because they were about to arrest someone who could afford the best legal defense money could buy, and any procedural error would be magnified and exploited. The team moved with practiced silence through the private elevator that serviced the penthouse, security having been instructed by building management to cooperate fully with law enforcement, a small victory in what Sarah knew would be a long legal battle. The elevator doors opened directly into Landon Fletcher's foyer, revealing a space that was somehow both minimalist and opulent. White marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city and ocean, art that belonged in museums hanging casually on walls like they were mass-produced prints. Sarah stepped out first, her warrant held prominently, and watched as Landon Fletcher appeared in the doorway to his living room wearing silk pajamas and a cashmere robe that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. What struck Sarah immediately was his composure. No surprise, no fear, no panic that police had just invaded his home at dawn. Instead, he looked almost amused, like this was an interesting development in a game he was playing rather than the end of his freedom. "Detective Chun," Landon said smoothly, his voice betraying neither surprise nor concern. What an unexpected pleasure. I assume you have a warrant for this dramatic entrance, or should I call my attorneys to discuss unlawful entry? Sarah presented the warrant, watching Landon's eyes scan the document with the rapid assessment of someone accustomed to processing complex information quickly. She saw the moment understanding dawned. Not guilt or remorse, but recognition that he'd been caught, that somehow his perfect plan had developed flaws. Landon Whitmore Fletcher, you're under arrest for the murders of Donovan Pierce Fletcher and Joshua Reed Fletcher, Sarah stated formally, her voice carrying through the penthouse's expensive emptiness. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. The reading of Miranda rights seemed almost absurd in this context. Landon Fletcher could afford an entire firm of attorneys, and they both knew it. But Sarah followed protocol precisely because she understood that this arrest would be scrutinized by lawyers, judges, and media for months or years to come. What happened next would become a crucial piece of evidence demonstrating Landon's character and his belief in his own invulnerability. As officers moved forward with handcuffs, Landon held up one hand in a stopping gesture, his expression shifting to something that might have been calculation or perhaps genuine curiosity about whether Sarah could be bought. Before we proceed with this unfortunate misunderstanding, Detective, I'd like to make you an offer, Landon said quietly, his voice pitched so that only Sarah could hear clearly. 7 figures deposited wherever you like, in whatever way makes you comfortable. Plus a corner office at Fletcher Biotech with a vice presidency title and salary to match. All you have to do is lose that warrant affidavit on your way back downtown. Tell your team there was an error in the paperwork, and we all walk away from this embarrassing situation. The audacity of it took Sarah's breath away for a moment. He was attempting to bribe a police officer during his own arrest, apparently unable to imagine that someone might not be for sale at any price. Sarah's response was immediate and would be immortalized in the body camera footage that every officer wore. Add attempted bribery of a police officer to the charges, she instructed her team, her voice cold and professional while maintaining direct eye contact with Landon. Mr. Fletcher seems to believe everyone has a price. Let's show him what actual integrity looks like. The handcuffs closed around Landon's wrists with a definitive click that echoed in the vast penthouse. And for just a moment, Sarah saw his mask slip, a flash of genuine anger and perhaps even fear before the controlled businessman expression returned. As they led him to the elevator, Landon maintained his dignity as best he could, his expensive pajamas and handcuffs creating a jarring visual that the news helicopters would capture once they emerged from the building. The perp walk became national news within hours, the billionaire CEO in designer sleepwear being led to a police vehicle while maintaining an expression of dignified indignation rather than shame or remorse. At police headquarters, Landon immediately invoked his right to counsel and refused to answer any questions, exactly as Sarah had expected. Within 2 hours, an impressive legal team had assembled, not the corporate attorneys from Fletcher Biotech who handled contracts and regulatory compliance, but specialized criminal defense lawyers flown in from New York and Los Angeles, their combined hourly rates exceeding what most families earned in a year. Sarah used this time to continue building her case, focusing now on establishing the complete picture of motive, means, and opportunity that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. She knew that Landon's wealth would buy him aggressive legal representation, expert witnesses who would challenge every piece of evidence, and a public relations campaign designed to create sympathy and doubt. Her job was to make the evidence so overwhelming that no amount of legal maneuvering could overcome it. The financial forensics team had been working parallel to Sarah's investigation, and their findings provided the first major element of motive. Over a period of 5 years, Landon Fletcher had systematically embezzled $400 million from Fletcher Biotech through an elaborate scheme involving phantom research projects, inflated contracts, and a network of shell companies that ultimately funneled money back to accounts he controlled personally. The complexity was breathtaking. Offshore trusts layered through multiple jurisdictions, legitimate-looking invoices for work that was never performed, and defense contracts where the government had paid for research that existed only on paper. It was the kind of financial crime that required both genius-level intelligence and absolute amorality. The work of someone who viewed rules and laws as obstacles for lesser minds rather than boundaries for his own behavior. Most importantly, the forensics team recovered emails from Donovan Fletcher's secure accounts confirming that he had discovered this fraud and was preparing a whistleblower complaint to the Securities and Exchange Commission, scheduled to be filed on July 6, just 2 days after his death. The timing was devastating to any innocent interpretation. Donovan had confronted Landon about the embezzlement in late June, giving him roughly 1 week to either prepare a defense, flee the country, or eliminate the threat. Landon had chosen the third option, planning and executing a double murder with the same methodical approach he brought to corporate strategy. The whistleblower filing, if it had proceeded, would have triggered immediate asset freezes, criminal investigation, and Landon's removal as CEO, pending resolution of the allegations. His life as he knew it would have ended. No more penthouse, no more private jets, no more respect and admiration from San Diego's elite. For a narcissist like Landon Fletcher, that loss of status and control was apparently worse than the moral weight of murdering his own brothers. The financial motive alone was compelling, but when combined with the physical evidence and timeline, it created a picture of premeditated murder that would be extremely difficult for any defense team to overcome. The second element of motive emerged from the Fletcher family trust documents, which Sarah subpoenaed from the estate attorneys. Marissa Fletcher, the family matriarch, had structured the trust with a specific succession clause that Sarah immediately recognized as crucial to understanding why Landon had struck when he did. Upon Marissa's death or incapacitation, control of Fletcher Biotech would pass to her 3 sons jointly, but any major decisions regarding company leadership required unanimous agreement. It was designed to force collaboration and prevent any single brother from dominating the others, a well-intentioned safeguard that had become a death sentence for 2 of them. Trust attorneys confirmed in interviews that Donovan and Joshua had been meeting privately to discuss voting Landon out as CEO once succession occurred, citing concerns about his ethical lapses and increasingly erratic decision-making. Marissa's terminal cancer diagnosis in June 2023 had accelerated this timeline. Succession was imminent, potentially within months, and Landon would have found himself outvoted by brothers who were aligned against him. By murdering Donovan and Joshua, Landon had eliminated the only obstacles to his continued control of the company he'd built. With both brothers dead, there was no one to challenge his authority, no unanimous vote required, no threat to his position. It was cold, calculated business strategy applied to family relationships, treating his brothers as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings with inherent value beyond their usefulness to his plans. Sarah documented this motive carefully, understanding that juries needed to comprehend why someone would commit such horrific acts. Money and power were motivations that everyone could understand, even if most people would never act on them. The trust documents also revealed another detail that would prove significant. Sterling Fletcher was designated as the next-generation heir, with substantial assets flowing to her upon Landon's death. This meant that if Landon was convicted and executed, Sterling would inherit enormous wealth, creating a potential defense argument that she had motive to frame her father. Sarah made note of this vulnerability in the prosecution's case, knowing that Landon's attorneys would certainly exploit it. The psychological dimension of Landon's motive was established through a detailed analysis of his communications, personal writings, and behavior patterns conducted by forensic psychologist Dr. Elaine Park. Dr. Park had been studying the psychology of white-collar criminals and narcissistic personalities for 2 decades, and she found Landon Fletcher to be a textbook case of what she called malignant narcissism with sociopathic features. Someone who combined grandiose self-image with complete disregard for others' well-being and an absence of genuine emotional connection even to family members. Dr. Park analyzed text messages, emails, and personal journals that had been seized during the search of Landon's properties, finding consistent patterns of contempt toward his brothers, particularly when they questioned his decisions or were praised by others. Landon saw himself as the brilliant strategist surrounded by lesser minds, and any suggestion that his brothers might be his equals or even superiors in some dimensions triggered intense resentment. The final trigger, Dr. Park determined, had been a text exchange on July 2nd between Landon and Donovan, where Donovan threatened to reveal Sterling's sealed juvenile record to prevent her from inheriting if Landon didn't step down voluntarily. The juvenile record involved a minor drug possession incident from when Sterling was 16, something that had been handled through counseling and sealed by the court. But Donovan apparently believed that threatening to unseal it would give him leverage over his brother. Instead, it seems to have been the final straw for Landon, an attack not just on his position or finances, but on his daughter and his legacy. In Landon's twisted psychology, murdering his brothers became not just expedient, but justified, a protective action for Sterling combined with punishment for Donovan and Joshua's betrayal of family loyalty. Dr. Park would later testify that this combination of narcissistic injury, threatened loss of control, and rationalization through family protection was a dangerous psychological cocktail that enabled Landon to commit fratricide without apparent remorse or moral conflict. As the investigation moved into its second week, additional evidence continued to surface that reinforced the prosecution's case. Customs records showed that Fletcher Biotech had imported a rare precursor chemical used in advanced neurotoxin synthesis, with import forms bearing Landon's personal signature. The shipment had arrived at the port of San Diego in mid-June, and inventory analysis showed discrepancies between the amount received and the amount used for documented research projects, exactly the quantity that would be needed to synthesize the Fletcher X-27 compound found in the victim's systems. Chemical analysis of samples from Landon's laboratory matched the molecular signature of the neurotoxin, confirming that it had been created in Fletcher Biotech facilities rather than purchased from external sources. This was crucial because it established that only someone with access to those specific facilities and knowledge of the proprietary synthesis methods could have created the murder weapon. The digital evidence that Sterling had provided through her anonymous tip was authenticated by cybersecurity experts who confirmed that the documents had been created on Landon's personal laptop and had been mistakenly synced to a shared family cloud storage account. The files included not just the DNA elimination timeline, but also detailed notes on Fletcher X-27's properties, synthesis procedures, and expected effects on human subjects. There were even photographs that Landon had taken during the synthesis process, showing laboratory equipment, chemical compounds, and handwritten notes with his distinctive writing style. It was a complete record of premeditation, the kind of documentation that prosecutors dream about but rarely find in murder cases. The fact that Landon had kept such detailed records suggested both his scientific methodology, he documented everything, and his arrogance, believing that his security measures were sufficient to prevent anyone from discovering his plans. Sarah compiled all of this evidence into a comprehensive brief for the district attorney's office, creating a timeline that showed premeditation extending back weeks before the murders. Landon had researched neurotoxin delivery methods, ordered the necessary chemicals, accessed the synthesis laboratory in the middle of the night, traveled to the crime scene with the poison, administered it personally, and then returned to San Diego to control the investigation by insisting the bodies be examined in his city where he had influence. Each step demonstrated planning and consciousness of guilt, building a narrative of calculated murder rather than any kind of accidental or spontaneous violence. The brief ran to over 200 pages, including forensic reports, witness statements, financial analysis, and expert opinions, creating what Olivia Rodriguez would later describe as one of the most thoroughly documented murder cases in California history. The public response to Landon's arrest was divided in ways that reflected San Diego's complicated relationship with wealth and power. Many residents who had benefited from Fletcher Biotech's employment or philanthropy struggled to reconcile the generous benefactor they knew with the cold-blooded murderer being described in news reports. The company's stock plummeted 28% in the first trading day after the arrest, erasing billions in market value and triggering shareholder lawsuits that added civil consequences to Landon's criminal jeopardy. Fletcher Biotech's board called an emergency meeting and voted to temporarily suspend Landon as CEO while maintaining a public statement supporting the presumption of innocence, a carefully worded position that satisfied neither the company's critics nor its defenders. Media coverage was intense and largely sensational, focusing on the dramatic elements: the billionaire CEO, the poisoned champagne, the daughter who turned him in, rather than the more complex questions about corporate culture and ethical oversight that the case raised. Marissa Fletcher, the family matriarch, was devastated by the convergence of tragedies: 2 sons murdered and a third arrested for their murders, all while she was dying from cancer. Her condition deteriorated rapidly under the psychological strain, and she retreated into private medical care surrounded by nurses and the few family friends who felt comfortable staying close to the Fletcher name given the circumstances. For Marissa, the question of Landon's guilt must have been agonizing. Could she believe her eldest son capable of such evil, or would maternal loyalty demand she assume his innocence despite mounting evidence? She would never have to make that choice publicly, as her health would decline beyond the point where she could participate meaningfully in the legal proceedings. Sterling Fletcher found herself in an impossible position, having triggered the investigation that arrested her father while simultaneously grieving her uncles and grandmother and managing the public scrutiny that came with being connected to such a sensational case. As July turned to August, the prosecution's case continued to strengthen with each piece of evidence that emerged from forensic analysis and investigation. The monogrammed corkscrew became an almost symbolic piece of physical evidence. Landon's initials literally imprinted on the tool used to open the poisoned champagne, a mark of ownership that became a mark of guilt. Expert analysis showed that the tool marks on the cork matched that specific corkscrew with the same certainty as a fingerprint match, creating an unbreakable link between Landon Fletcher and the method of poison delivery. When combined with the traces of Fletcher X-27 found in the corkscrew's mechanism, it represented the kind of physical evidence that was very difficult for defense attorneys to explain away through alternate theories. Sarah felt confident that the case was strong enough to proceed to trial, though she remained aware that prosecuting someone with Landon Fletcher's resources would present challenges that went beyond evidence and into the realms of jury selection, media management, and the inherent advantages that wealth provided in the American legal system. The stage was set for what media outlets were already calling the trial of the century, a case that would test whether justice truly was blind to wealth and status, or whether being a billionaire meant different rules applied. Sterling Fletcher had always known her father was difficult. Growing up as Landon Fletcher's daughter meant navigating a childhood defined by expectations, control, and the constant pressure to be worthy of the Fletcher name. There were private tutors for subjects where her grades weren't perfect, summer programs at prestigious institutions to build her resume, and her father's ever-present assessment of whether she was maximizing her potential or wasting the advantages she'd been given. But Sterling had also seen moments of what seemed like genuine paternal affection. The pride in his eyes when she'd been accepted to Stanford, the way he'd fought the school board when they'd tried to discipline her unfairly, the college fund he'd established that would allow her any future she wanted. She'd convinced herself that beneath the demanding exterior was someone who loved her, even if he struggled to show it in conventional ways. That belief, that hope that her father was ultimately good despite his flaws, made what she discovered on that June evening so completely devastating that it would reshape her understanding of family, morality, and her own identity. It started innocently enough. Sterling was working on a digital media project for one of her Stanford classes that required compiling family photos into a multimedia presentation about generational change and family legacy. She'd asked her father for access to the family cloud storage where decades of photos, videos, and documents were archived, and he'd granted her access without hesitation because why would he suspect his daughter of stumbling onto evidence of his planned murders? Sterling was scrolling through folders of childhood photos, images from family vacations, and formal portraits from various Fletcher Biotech events when she noticed a folder that seemed out of place. It was titled Project Succession, which initially seemed like it might contain business documents, but the folder's privacy settings were odd. It should have been restricted to only Landon's account. But through what Sterling would later learn was a technical error in the cloud service's sharing permissions, she had access. Curious and not yet concerned, Sterling opened the folder expecting maybe business plans or estate documents. What she found instead was a file called D&J Elimination Timeline that would shatter her world completely. Reading through the document felt surreal, like discovering you're living in a nightmare rather than reality. Sterling saw her uncles' names, Donovan and Joshua, listed under targets for removal. She read detailed notes about Fletcher X-27, a neurotoxin her father had apparently created specifically to kill without easy detection. There were step-by-step instructions for how to introduce the poison into champagne, when to serve it for maximum effect, and how to ensure that only the targets consumed the lethal dose. There were diagrams of the Hamptons estate showing positioning during what the document called the elimination event, with notes about ensuring proper positioning for observation while maintaining plausible deniability. Sterling read these words, clinical, detached, treating her uncle's murders like a project plan with deliverables and timelines, and felt her entire understanding of her father collapse. This wasn't possible. Her father wasn't a murderer. This had to be some kind of research paper, maybe a theoretical exercise or a novel he was working on, anything except what it appeared to be, a literal manual for murdering his own brothers. Sterling's first instinct was denial. She convinced herself there had to be an innocent explanation, that she was misunderstanding sophisticated scientific documentation that wasn't actually about real murder. She closed the file and tried to focus on her school project, pushing down the growing horror and telling herself that tomorrow she'd ask her father about it directly and he'd explain that it was all a misunderstanding. But she couldn't stop thinking about the document, couldn't ignore the specific details that made innocent interpretation impossible. The dates referenced were real and upcoming. July 4th, 2023 was just days away, and the document described it as the optimal timing for removing obstacles before trust succession vote. Sterling reopened the file and found attached photographs that made her hands shake. Images of her father in a laboratory, taken as selfies or perhaps timer shots, showing him working with chemical compounds while wearing protective equipment. In one photo, he held a vial of clear liquid up to the light, his expression focused and clinical, and Sterling recognized the setting as Fletcher Biotech's restricted research facility where only authorized personnel could access the synthesis chambers. The full horror of what she was reading finally broke through Sterling's denial when she found a section of the document titled Post-Elimination Scenario Management that detailed how her father planned to act devastated, how he would insist on having the bodies examined in San Diego where he had influence, and how he would comfort their mother while internally celebrating his success. Reading her father describe his own planned performance of grief, understanding that he would stand over his murdered brothers and pretend devastation while knowing he'd killed them, Sterling felt physically ill. She ran to the bathroom and vomited, her body rejecting what her mind was being forced to accept. Her father, the man who was supposed to protect family above all else, was planning to murder his own brothers for money and power. And the date was just 3 days away. If the document was real, if her father actually intended to do this, then Uncle Donovan and Uncle Joshua would be dead by the end of the Independence Day weekend unless someone stopped it. Sterling spent that night in agony, pacing her apartment near campus, unable to sleep or focus on anything except the impossible choice she was facing. If she reported what she'd found, she would be accusing her father of planned murder, triggering an investigation that would destroy him and the family name regardless of whether he was actually guilty. If she confronted him directly, he might be able to explain everything. But what if there was no innocent explanation? What if confronting him just warned him to be more careful, or worse? What if it put her in danger? Sterling had seen enough crime documentaries to know that people who discovered inconvenient truths sometimes became additional victims. But if she did nothing, if she convinced herself this was just a misunderstanding or something she should stay out of, and then her uncles actually died according to that timeline, she would spend the rest of her life knowing she could have prevented it and chose not to. The weight of that potential guilt was crushing. How could she live with herself if she had information that could save lives and failed to act on it? By morning, Sterling had made a decision that would require more courage than anything she'd ever done. She couldn't confront her father directly because she didn't trust herself to handle his response, whatever it might be. She couldn't discuss it with other family members because they would either dismiss her concerns or confront Landon themselves, potentially escalating the danger. The only option that both protected her uncles and preserved the possibility of her being wrong was to report what she'd found to authorities anonymously and let them investigate. If it was all a misunderstanding, if her father had a legitimate explanation, then the investigation would clear him. But if he was actually planning murder, then law enforcement could prevent it and gather evidence without relying solely on what she'd found. Sterling researched how to report information anonymously, learning about the San Diego Police Department's secure tip portal that allowed submissions without requiring personal identification. She carefully compiled access information for the cloud storage folder, providing login credentials that would allow investigators to verify everything she'd seen without her having to explain or justify how she'd obtained the information. The process of actually submitting the tip took hours because Sterling kept stopping, questioning whether she was doing the right thing, wondering if she was destroying her father's life over a misunderstanding. But every time she hesitated, she thought about Uncle Donovan's kids who would grow up without their father, about Uncle Joshua's fiancée planning a wedding that would never happen, about her grandmother who would be devastated by losing her sons. Sterling thought about what it meant to be a good person, whether family loyalty meant protecting someone even when they were planning to do something evil, or whether real love sometimes meant stopping someone from becoming a monster. In the end, she submitted the tip at 2:47 a.m. on July 2nd, then immediately felt a combination of relief and terror about what she'd just set in motion. She hadn't even signed her name, but somehow it felt like she'd just killed some essential part of her relationship with her father, like there was no going back from this point regardless of what the investigation discovered. The next 2 days were surreal for Sterling. She attended the Independence Day gathering at the Hamptons estate as planned, watching her father interact with his brothers while knowing she'd reported him for planning their murders, looking for signs that her tip had triggered some kind of police investigation, but seeing nothing obvious. When her father opened that expensive champagne and proposed a toast, Sterling felt her heart racing, wondering if this was it, if she was watching the murder she'd tried to prevent. She noticed details that would haunt her later. The way her father had poured from that bottle for her uncles, but seemed to drink from a different glass himself. The slight tremor in his hands that she'd never seen before. The intensity of his focus as he watched them drink. And then, about 40 minutes later, when Uncle Joshua started showing signs of disorientation and Uncle Donovan clutched his chest, Sterling understood with horrible certainty that her father had actually done it. He'd followed through with his plan despite her anonymous tip, either because the authorities hadn't taken it seriously enough to investigate immediately, or because they were investigating but hadn't had time to prevent the murders. Her uncles were dying in front of her, and her father had killed them exactly as his document had described. The trauma of witnessing her uncles' deaths while knowing her father had caused them was compounded by having to maintain the pretense of ignorance. Sterling couldn't reveal that she'd suspected anything without explaining about the documents she'd found and the tip she'd filed, which would immediately identify her as the source and potentially put her in danger if her father realized she'd tried to stop him. So she played the role of devastated niece and granddaughter, calling 911 with genuine panic because even though she'd suspected this might happen, the reality of watching 2 people die from poisoning was more horrific than anything she'd imagined. She watched her father perform grief with practiced skill, marveling at his ability to fake devastation while knowing he'd orchestrated everything, and feeling a combination of horror and strange disconnected curiosity about how someone could be so completely devoid of normal human emotion. This was her father, the man who'd raised her, and he was a monster wearing a human mask. The realization was so fundamentally disorienting that Sterling felt like reality itself had become unreliable. In the days following the murders, Sterling waited for contact from investigators, expecting that they would trace her anonymous tip and want to interview her. When Detective Sarachin finally reached out requesting a meeting, Sterling had to decide whether to maintain her anonymity or reveal that she'd been the source of the original tip. The decision was complicated by her father's arrest. Once Landon was in custody, Sterling felt marginally safer acknowledging her role, but she also knew that admitting she'd reported him would make their father-daughter relationship public knowledge and subject her to intense media scrutiny and public judgment. Some people would see her as heroic for turning in a murderer despite family ties. Others would view her as a traitor who destroyed her father for money or attention. Sterling met with Detective Chun and initially provided information without acknowledging the anonymous tip, but as the investigation progressed and the detective mentioned that anonymous evidence had been crucial to building the case, Sterling felt compelled to be honest about her role. "I was the anonymous tipster," she admitted during one of their conversations. "I found his plans about 3 weeks before he killed them. I tried to stop it by reporting him, but he did it anyway." Revealing herself as the source of the crucial evidence transformed Sterling's position from witness to something more like co-investigator, and it created a complicated relationship with the prosecution. District Attorney Olivia Rodriguez recognized that Sterling's testimony would be incredibly powerful, a daughter finding her father's murder plans, attempting to prevent the crime, and then courageously choosing to testify despite family pressure. But it also made her vulnerable to defense attacks questioning her motives and credibility. Sterling agreed to full cooperation, including providing detailed testimony about discovering the documents, her decision-making process, and what she'd observed at the family gathering. But the prosecution team was concerned about the emotional toll on a 19-year-old who would essentially be helping send her father to death row, and they arranged for Sterling to receive counseling and protection, given that she might be at risk from people loyal to Landon who viewed her as a traitor. The most difficult decision Sterling faced was whether to visit her father after his arrest. Part of her wanted answers, needed to understand how the person who'd raised her could be capable of such calculated evil. Another part of her never wanted to see him again, wanted to cut all ties and start rebuilding her life without the Fletcher name weighing her down. But Detective Chun approached her with a proposal that would put Sterling in an impossible position while potentially securing additional evidence for the prosecution. Would Sterling be willing to wear a wire during jail visits with her father, recording their conversations in hopes that Landon might make incriminating statements? The detective explained that Landon still trusted Sterling completely, seeing her as the one family member firmly in his corner, and that trust could be leveraged to gather evidence that would strengthen an already solid case into something absolutely unbeatable. Sterling agreed to wear the wire, though the decision haunted her even as she made it. Over a series of visits between September and October, she sat across from her father in the county jail visiting room, wearing recording equipment hidden under her clothes, and drew out conversations about his motives and planning. Landon, believing he was talking privately with his daughter, revealed elements of his thinking that confirmed the prosecution's theory of the case. He talked about how Donovan's threat to expose Sterling's sealed juvenile record had been a final betrayal that justified his response, framing the murders as somehow protective of her even though Sterling had never asked for or wanted such protection. "He was going to use your mistake to hurt us both, Sterling," Landon said during one recorded conversation. "I couldn't allow that. Everything I did was to secure your future, to make sure you'd inherit the company without obstacles or scandals that could diminish what I built for you." The twisted logic of using murder as paternal protection was chilling, and Sterling had to maintain her composure while internally screaming at the manipulation her father was attempting even from jail. The emotional cost of these wire visits was enormous. Sterling was essentially betraying her father's trust by recording him, but she rationalized it as justice for her uncles who deserved someone to speak for them since they couldn't speak for themselves anymore. Each visit left her feeling dirty and damaged, like she was becoming complicit in manipulation and deception even though her goal was to expose rather than enable wrongdoing. Her therapist worked with her to process the complex emotions, grief for her uncles, betrayal by her father, guilt about her role in his arrest, and anger at being put in this impossible position. Sterling began to understand that she was grieving multiple losses simultaneously: her uncles who'd been murdered, her father who'd revealed himself as a monster, her grandmother who was dying from cancer accelerated by family trauma, and her own previous understanding of who she was and where she came from. The Fletcher name that had once been a source of pride was now something she wanted to distance herself from, though she also felt responsible for somehow redeeming it by using her inheritance for good rather than letting her father's evil be the final word on what the family represented. As the trial approached, Sterling made a public commitment to establishing a foundation in her uncle's names that would support ethical innovation and whistleblower protection. It was a direct repudiation of everything her father represented and a statement that she intended to use Fletcher resources to prevent the kind of corporate corruption and moral compromise that had led to her uncle's murders. The foundation announcement was cathartic for Sterling, a way of declaring that she was choosing her uncle's values over her father's, that the next generation of Fletchers would stand for integrity rather than ruthless self-interest. But even as she made these plans, Sterling struggled with complicated feelings about testifying against her father at trial. She knew her testimony would be damning, that the recordings she'd made would essentially guarantee his conviction, and despite everything he'd done, some part of her still loved the father she'd thought he was before discovering the truth about his capacity for evil. That residual love made her feel guilty, as if caring about him at all was somehow a betrayal of her murdered uncles. Sterling had to learn to hold multiple truths simultaneously. Her father had been both a real parent who'd raised her and a monster who'd murdered his brothers, and both those realities could be true without negating each other. The legal system would judge his crimes, but Sterling's heart would have to find a way to grieve the father she'd lost while accepting that he'd never really been who she thought he was. By January 2024, 6 months after the murders, the trial of Landon Whitmore Fletcher had become the most anticipated courtroom proceeding in California since the high-profile cases of the 1990s that had captivated the nation. The San Diego County Courthouse had been transformed into what felt like a fortress, with security checkpoints, media credentials being scrutinized intensely, and crowds of curious onlookers gathering daily, hoping to catch a glimpse of the billionaire defendant who'd allegedly poisoned his own brothers. Inside Courtroom 4A, Judge Eleanor Blackwood presided over proceedings with the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that had made her reputation as someone who wouldn't be influenced by wealth, status, or media pressure. She'd been selected for this case specifically because of her track record handling high-profile defendants, and she'd already made clear that she expected professional conduct from both sides regardless of how much money was being spent on legal representation. The prosecution table was led by District Attorney Olivia Rodriguez, a veteran prosecutor who'd spent 23 years building cases against everyone from street-level dealers to corporate executives, and who'd made her reputation on meticulous preparation and devastating cross-examinations. Olivia had assembled a team that included forensic specialists, financial experts, and victim advocates, creating what amounted to a small army dedicated to securing justice for Donovan and Joshua Fletcher. The prosecution strategy was straightforward: present overwhelming evidence of premeditation, establish clear motive through financial and psychological analysis, and use Sterling's testimony along with the recorded conversations to demonstrate Landon's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Olivia knew that the defense would try to create alternate theories and attack the credibility of key evidence, so her approach was to build redundancy into every element of the case, ensuring that even if the defense successfully challenged one piece of evidence, there were multiple other pieces supporting the same conclusion. The defense table presented an intimidating display of legal firepower. Warren Hoffman, a $2,000 per hour criminal defense attorney whose client list read like a who's who of wealthy defendants, led a team that included jury consultants, private investigators, and expert witnesses prepared to challenge every aspect of the prosecution's case. Hoffman's reputation was built on creating reasonable doubt in cases that seemed airtight, finding that one weak link in the chain of evidence that could unravel an entire prosecution theory. His strategy for defending Landon Fletcher involved multiple prongs. Attack the reliability of the forensic evidence by suggesting contamination or mishandling. Challenge Sterling's credibility by questioning her motives for turning against her father. Present alternative explanations for the brothers' deaths involving rare medical conditions, and most importantly, portray Landon as a brilliant innovator whose contributions to medicine and science should be weighed against the circumstantial nature of the evidence against him. It was a strategy that required walking a fine line, acknowledging the tragedy of the brothers' deaths while subtly suggesting the prosecution had rushed to judgment against an easy target because of his wealth and prominence. Jury selection had taken 3 full weeks, with both sides carefully evaluating potential jurors for any signs of bias regarding wealth, corporate power, or family violence. The final jury of 9 women and 3 men represented a cross-section of San Diego: a retired teacher, an accountant, a small business owner, a social worker, and others whose backgrounds suggested they could evaluate complex evidence without being swayed by either Landon's status or media sensationalism. Judge Blackwood had been particularly careful during voir dire to identify and dismiss anyone who expressed strong opinions about the case based on news coverage, anyone with connections to Fletcher Biotech or its competitors, and anyone who seemed incapable of imposing the death penalty if the evidence warranted it. The final 12 jurors and 4 alternates were sworn in on January 10th, and opening statements were scheduled for January 15th, a Monday that felt weighted with the significance of what was about to unfold. Olivia Rodriguez's opening statement was a masterclass in narrative construction. She didn't begin with the murders themselves, but with the Fletcher brothers' childhood, painting a picture of 3 boys who'd grown up with privilege, but also with the pressure of family expectations, and their father's competitive dynamics. She described how those boys had grown into men who chose different paths: Donovan, the charismatic operator; Joshua, the ethical scientist; and Landon, the brilliant but ruthless strategist who'd never learned to value anything beyond winning. This case is about betrayal at the most fundamental level, Olivia told the jury, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. On Independence Day 2023, Donovan and Joshua Fletcher gathered with their family to celebrate their mother's wish for one final holiday together before her cancer advanced. They trusted their brother Landon when he handed them glasses of champagne. They trusted him as brothers, as business partners, as family. And that trust was met with poison. The prosecutor methodically laid out the timeline of evidence the jury would see over the coming weeks: the embezzlement that gave Landon financial motive, the trust succession rules that gave him power motive, the psychological analysis that explained his pathological need to eliminate threats to his control. She described the synthesis of Fletcher X-27 in the middle of the night, the champagne delivery method, and the digital murder manual that Sterling had discovered. Olivia presented enlarged photographs on screens visible throughout the courtroom. Images of the monogrammed corkscrew, the champagne bottle, molecular diagrams of the neurotoxin, and most powerfully, photos of Donovan and Joshua Fletcher in life, smiling and vital, contrasted with the autopsy images showing them lifeless on examination tables. The defense will try to convince you that this evidence is circumstantial, that there could be other explanations, Olivia concluded. But when you've heard all the testimony and seen all the evidence, you'll understand that there's only one explanation that fits every fact. Landon Fletcher murdered his brothers with scientific precision because they threatened his money, his power, and his ego. And he did it believing his wealth would protect him from consequences. This trial is about proving him wrong. Warren Hoffman's opening statement took a different approach, beginning with an acknowledgement of the tragedy that had befallen the Fletcher family, but immediately pivoting to challenge the prosecution's narrative. "The state has presented you with a compelling story," Hoffman began, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who defended dozens of high-profile clients successfully. "But that's all it is, a story crafted from circumstantial evidence, speculation, and family dysfunction, not the kind of proof that should send a man to his death." Hoffman's strategy was to humanize Landon while systematically attacking each element of the prosecution's case, suggesting that lab access records could be mistaken, that the neurotoxin evidence might represent contamination from the medical examiner's handling, that Sterling's testimony was motivated by father-daughter conflict rather than genuine belief in his guilt. The defense attorney spent significant time on Landon's contributions to San Diego, the jobs created, the medical innovations developed, the charitable contributions made, creating a subtext that prosecuting him was somehow an attack on the city's prosperity and innovation economy. The most controversial element of Hoffman's opening statement was his introduction of an alternative explanation for the brothers' deaths. The prosecution wants you to believe that Landon Fletcher synthesized a sophisticated poison and used it to murder his brothers, Hoffman said. But what if there's a simpler, more tragic explanation? What if Donovan and Joshua Fletcher suffered from an undiagnosed genetic condition that caused simultaneous cardiac events, exacerbated by the champagne they consumed and medications they were taking? It was a theory that would require extensive expert testimony to support, but Hoffman planted the seed early, giving jurors an alternative framework for interpreting the evidence they were about to see. He concluded by appealing to reasonable doubt, reminding the jury that the standard of proof was beyond reasonable doubt, not beyond all doubt, but emphasizing that the circumstantial nature of much of the evidence should give them pause before convicting a man whose terminal cancer diagnosis meant he had limited time left regardless of the trial's outcome. The prosecution's case began with the medical examiner, Dr. Melissa Werner, whose testimony established the cause of death as acute neurotoxic poisoning rather than any natural cause. Using detailed autopsy reports and tissue samples, Dr. Werner walked the jury through the specific patterns of organ failure and cellular damage that indicated exposure to a synthetic compound designed to disrupt neural function. Her testimony was technical but accessible, explaining in layman's terms how the Fletcher X-27 neurotoxin had essentially shut down the brothers' nervous systems, paralyzing their respiratory muscles while leaving them conscious enough to experience their own deaths. It was gruesome testimony that visibly affected several jurors, particularly when Dr. Werner described the timeline of symptoms: the initial disorientation, the progressive paralysis, the suffocation as their bodies lost the ability to draw breath. Defense cross-examination attempted to suggest that the medical examiner might have missed signs of natural disease or misinterpreted the tissue damage, but Dr. Werner remained unshakable, her decades of experience allowing her to deflect every suggestion that she'd somehow gotten the cause of death wrong. The scientific foundation of the prosecution's case was further established through Dr. James Harrington, the independent toxicologist who'd identified Fletcher X-27 from the tissue samples. Dr. Harrington's testimony was crucial because it established that the neurotoxin wasn't something that could be purchased or accidentally created. It was a sophisticated synthetic compound that required advanced knowledge of biochemistry and access to specialized equipment. Using molecular models and chemical diagrams, Dr. Harrington explained how the compound's structure bore unique characteristics that matched patents held personally by Landon Fletcher, creating a direct scientific link between the defendant and the murder weapon. "This isn't the kind of thing you stumble across," Dr. Harrington testified. "Someone designed this compound specifically for its lethal properties while building in characteristics that would make detection difficult. It's brilliant work from a scientific perspective, but it's brilliance applied to murder." The defense attempted to suggest that other scientists at Fletcher Biotech could have created the toxin, but Dr. Harrington systematically explained why the specific stabilization methods and molecular markers pointed uniquely to Landon's research methodology. Detective Sarah Chin's testimony consumed 2 full days, during which she methodically walked the jury through her investigation from the initial medical examiner findings to Landon's arrest. Sarah presented security footage showing Landon entering Fletcher Biotech's synthesis laboratory at 2:13 a.m. on July 4th, explained the significance of customs records showing his signature on import documents for rare precursor chemicals, and detailed the timeline that placed him in the lab creating the poison, then at the Hamptons estate administering it, and finally back in San Diego positioning himself to control the investigation. Her testimony included the dramatic moment of Landon's arrest and his attempt to bribe her with 7 figures and a corporate position, captured on body camera footage that the prosecution played for the jury. Watching Landon calmly attempt to buy his way out of murder charges had a visible impact on jurors, several of whom took notes during that portion of the testimony, their expressions suggesting they were seeing confirmation of the arrogance and sense of privilege that the prosecution had been describing. The financial motive was established through SEC investigator Thomas Reynolds, who presented a detailed analysis of Landon's embezzlement scheme using flowcharts, bank records, and email evidence that showed how $400 million had been systematically stolen over 5 years. Reynolds explained the complexity of the fraud: phantom research projects that existed only on paper, defense contracts where money was diverted through shell companies, and offshore accounts layered through multiple jurisdictions to hide the ultimate beneficiary. Most damaging were the emails between Donovan and Landon, where Donovan confronted his brother about the fraud and Landon first attempted to buy his silence, then responded with barely concealed threats when Donovan refused. "Your moral superiority is going to cost you everything," Landon had written in one email recovered from Donovan's secure server. "Think very carefully about whether exposing this is worth destroying our family and the company Dad built." At the time, that message had seemed like typical corporate hardball, but in the context of the murders that followed just weeks later, it read like a death threat. The family dynamics and psychological motive were explored through multiple witnesses who'd known the brothers throughout their lives. Victoria Strauss, Landon's ex-wife, provided devastating testimony about his character and his long-standing resentment toward his more charismatic brothers. She described how Landon would obsess over any perceived slight, how he'd interpret normal sibling dynamics as personal attacks, and how his need to be recognized as the superior Fletcher had intensified as his brothers gained respect in their own right. Victoria's most damaging contribution was the audio recording from May 2023, where Landon had speculated about how convenient it would be if his brothers weren't in the picture anymore. Playing that recording in the courtroom created a moment of electric tension as jurors heard Landon's voice discussing his brothers' potential deaths months before actually murdering them, establishing premeditation that went back far earlier than the immediate discovery of his embezzlement. Dr. Elaine Park, the forensic psychologist, testified about Landon's personality structure and how his combination of narcissistic entitlement and sociopathic traits had enabled him to rationalize fratricide as a justified response to perceived betrayal. Dr. Park explained that for someone with Landon's psychology, threats to his self-image and control were experienced as existential dangers that justified any response, including violence against family members. She walked the jury through text messages and journal entries that revealed Landon's obsessive comparison of himself to his brothers, his rage when they questioned his decisions, and his increasing conviction that he was surrounded by disloyal people who didn't appreciate his genius. The psychologist also addressed the terminal cancer diagnosis, explaining that rather than prompting reflection or remorse, it had likely accelerated Landon's timeline for eliminating obstacles and securing his legacy, creating a now-or-never mentality that removed whatever limited restraint he might have previously felt. The physical evidence linking Landon directly to the murder method was presented through forensic specialist Dr. Marcus Webb, whose analysis of the monogrammed corkscrew created an unbreakable connection between the defendant and the crime. Using advanced microscopy and 3D modeling, Dr. Webb demonstrated how the unique wear patterns on Landon's personal corkscrew matched exactly with marks on the cork from the poisoned champagne bottle. The match was so precise that Dr. Webb testified it was more certain than a fingerprint, given that the corkscrew's specific damage pattern from years of use created a unique signature that couldn't be replicated. Even more damaging, trace analysis had detected microscopic residue of Fletcher X-27 in the corkscrew's mechanism, indicating it had been used to open a bottle containing the neurotoxin. Defense attempts to suggest contamination during evidence handling were systematically dismantled through documentation of sealed storage and chain of custody procedures that made cross-contamination effectively impossible. As the prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks of testimony, the cumulative weight of evidence became overwhelming. Each witness added another layer to the narrative. Security guards who'd seen Landon at the lab in the middle of the night, corporate colleagues who'd witnessed his deteriorating relationship with his brothers, forensic accountants who'd traced the embezzled funds, and chemical suppliers who'd sold the precursor compounds. The defense attempted to challenge individual pieces of evidence through cross-examination, but the redundancy Olivia Rodriguez had built into her case meant that even when they succeeded in creating minor doubts about specific details, the overall picture remained intact. Landon sat through all of this with remarkable composure, occasionally whispering to his attorneys, but never showing the kind of emotional reaction that might humanize him to the jury. No tears, no visible remorse. Just the analytical focus of someone observing a business presentation rather than his own murder trial. The most anticipated testimony came in mid-February when Sterling Fletcher took the witness stand. The courtroom fell completely silent as the 19-year-old was sworn in, her composure remarkable given the emotional weight of testifying against her father. Olivia Rodriguez began gently, establishing Sterling's relationship with her father and uncles before addressing her discovery of the digital murder journal. Sterling's voice remained steady as she described finding the D&J elimination timeline document, her initial disbelief, and her growing horror as she realized her father was seriously planning to murder his brothers. "I wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation," Sterling testified, her eyes directed at the jury rather than her father, who watched her intently from the defense table. But the document was too specific, too detailed. It included chemical formulas, diagrams of the house, timing for the toast, everything. And there were photos of my father in the lab creating the poison. There was no way to misinterpret what I was reading. Sterling's testimony about her decision to file the anonymous tip while maintaining the appearance of normalcy at the family gathering was particularly powerful. She described the agony of watching her father open that champagne bottle knowing what might be in it. The 40 minutes of conversation before her uncles showed symptoms feeling like an eternity, and the horror of watching them die while her father performed concern. "He was convincing," Sterling said, her voice finally breaking slightly with emotion. "If I hadn't known the truth, I would have believed he was devastated. But I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was managing the situation rather than reacting emotionally. He was directing a performance, making sure the bodies would be examined in San Diego where he had influence, controlling every detail even in the middle of what was supposed to be a family tragedy. The testimony was devastating not just for its content, but for what it represented: a daughter choosing justice over family loyalty, risking her inheritance and relationship to ensure her uncle's murderer faced consequences. The defense's cross-examination of Sterling was notably restrained, with Warren Hoffman clearly aware that attacking a sympathetic witness could backfire spectacularly with the jury. He focused on suggesting that Sterling might have misinterpreted research documents, that her relationship with her father had been strained over money and control issues, and that her cooperation with prosecutors might be motivated by financial incentives or desire for independence from parental authority. Sterling handled these suggestions with remarkable poise, acknowledging that she and her father had argued about her foundation plans, but firmly rejecting any suggestion that she'd fabricated evidence or lied about what she'd discovered. "I loved my father," Sterling said at one point, looking directly at Hoffman. "Turning him in was the hardest thing I've ever done. But my uncles deserve justice, and I couldn't let him get away with murder just because he's my dad." The raw honesty of that statement seemed to affect even the defense attorney, who concluded his cross-examination relatively quickly rather than risking further damage to his client's case. The prosecution introduced the recorded conversations from Sterling's wire visits as their final major evidence. These recordings, made during September and October while Landon was in county jail, captured him making incriminating statements that confirmed the prosecution's theory of his motives. In one particularly damaging exchange, Landon told Sterling that he'd had no choice but to remove Donovan and Joshua because they were going to destroy everything I built and hurt your inheritance. He described the murders in coldly utilitarian terms, framing them as necessary business decisions rather than crimes against family. "They didn't understand what was at stake," Landon's voice said through the courtroom speakers. "Your uncle Donovan thought he could threaten to expose your juvenile record and force me to step down. He thought I'd choose my position over protecting you. He was wrong about that." The recordings revealed Landon's complete lack of remorse and his twisted rationalization that he'd somehow murdered his brothers to protect his daughter, a justification that Sterling's visible pain, while listening to the recordings, thoroughly undermined. The defense case began in late February with their attempt to present alternative medical explanations for the brothers' deaths. Dr. Howard Reynolds, a cardiologist retained by the defense, proposed that both brothers might have suffered from undiagnosed long QT syndrome, a hereditary cardiac condition that could theoretically cause sudden death, particularly when combined with alcohol consumption and stress. The theory was creative but fell apart under Olivia Rodriguez's cross-examination, which produced the brothers' complete medical records showing recent comprehensive cardiac workups that had detected no such condition. When pressed, Dr. Reynolds had to admit that the probability of two brothers with no history of cardiac issues suddenly dying of undiagnosed heart conditions simultaneously was extremely unlikely, a concession that effectively destroyed the defense's alternative explanation. Subsequent medical experts brought by the defense fared similarly, each offering theoretical possibilities that crumbled when confronted with the specific evidence of Fletcher X-27 in the victim's systems and the tissue damage patterns that were inconsistent with natural causes. The second pillar of the defense strategy involved character witnesses who testified to Landon's contributions to science and society. University administrators described research grants that had advanced medical knowledge. Hospital directors detailed life-saving technologies developed under Landon's leadership, and charity directors enumerated millions in donations that had transformed communities. While these testimonials effectively established that Landon had done significant good in his professional capacity, they inadvertently reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of him as someone with a compartmentalized morality, capable of philanthropy and innovation in public while committing calculated murder in private. The juxtaposition of hearing about Landon's charitable works immediately after testimony about his poisoning his brothers created a cognitive dissonance that seemed to disturb jurors rather than generating the sympathy the defense had hoped for. The most unexpected development in the defense case came when Landon's attorneys revealed his terminal pancreatic cancer diagnosis and called Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, an oncologist, to provide his prognosis. Dr. Morgan testified that Landon had approximately 6 months to live with aggressive treatment, possibly less if the stress of incarceration accelerated disease progression. The defense strategy was clearly to generate sympathy by showing that Landon was dying anyway, questioning the purpose of a lengthy trial and potential death sentence for someone who wouldn't live long enough to see execution. But Olivia Rodriguez's cross-examination revealed that Landon had been diagnosed in early 2023, months before the murders, transforming the terminal illness from a mitigating factor into additional evidence of motive. So Mr. Fletcher knew he was dying when he planned these murders? Olivia asked. When Dr. Morgan confirmed this timeline, the prosecutor continued, "Isn't it possible that his diagnosis accelerated his timeline for eliminating obstacles and securing control of his company before time ran out?" The reframe was devastating. Landon hadn't murdered despite being terminally ill, but because of it, treating his final months as a last opportunity to consolidate power and eliminate threats. As the defense case concluded in early March, it was clear that Warren Hoffman and his team had been unable to overcome the weight of evidence against their client. They'd challenged individual pieces of testimony and evidence, raised questions about chain of custody and forensic procedures, and attempted to humanize Landon through character witnesses and his illness. But they hadn't been able to construct a coherent alternative narrative that explained all the evidence: the lab access, the champagne delivery method, the financial motive, Sterling's discoveries, and most damningly, Landon's own recorded words describing the murders in coldly utilitarian terms. The stage was set for closing arguments and what would become one of the most dramatic moments in the trial's history: Landon Fletcher's stunning decision to dismiss his legal team and represent himself for the remainder of proceedings. On the morning of March 11th, 2024, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation as attorneys prepared for closing arguments that would synthesize weeks of testimony into final presentations for the jury. But before proceedings could begin, Landon Fletcher stood and made an announcement that shocked everyone present, including his own legal team. "Your Honor, I'm dismissing my attorneys and will represent myself for the remainder of this trial," he stated, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he'd used in countless boardroom presentations. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Judge Blackwood immediately called for a recess, gathering all parties in chambers to address this unexpected development. Over the next hour, Judge Blackwood strongly advised against self-representation, explaining the complexity of capital murder cases and the disadvantages Landon would face without professional legal counsel. But Landon remained adamant, signing the necessary waivers with the same confident signature that had appeared on those fateful customs forms for neurotoxin precursor chemicals. "I built a billion-dollar company from nothing, Your Honor," Landon said during the chamber's discussion, his arrogance evident in every word. "I think I can handle presenting a legal argument to 12 ordinary citizens." Judge Blackwood's expression suggested she thought this was a catastrophic mistake, but she was legally obligated to allow defendants to represent themselves if they insisted, even when doing so was clearly against their own interests. Warren Hoffman and his team were visibly relieved to be dismissed despite the substantial fees they would forfeit, with Hoffman's parting comment to colleagues captured by court personnel being particularly telling. "He's determined to self-destruct, and I won't be the one standing next to him when he does." The legal team gathered their materials and departed, leaving Landon Fletcher alone at the defense table, about to take direct control of a case where his life hung in the balance. When court reconvened that afternoon, the atmosphere was charged with a different kind of tension. Landon had changed from his usual courtroom attire into an even more expensive suit, as if dressing for a particularly important business presentation rather than the fight for his life. He'd arranged his notes with meticulous precision, creating the appearance of a prepared professional rather than a desperate defendant gambling everything on his ability to persuade the jury. Olivia Rodriguez watched this performance with a mixture of fascination and strategic calculation. Landon's decision to represent himself was a gift to the prosecution because it would allow them to cross-examine him directly if he chose to testify, something defense attorneys would never have permitted. But it also introduced unpredictability into the proceedings, as Landon was clearly planning something dramatic rather than simply following conventional legal strategy. Judge Blackwood began with a final warning about the risks of self-representation, which Landon acknowledged with the confident dismissal of someone accustomed to ignoring expert advice that contradicted his desired course of action. "Your Honor, "I've spent my life being underestimated," he replied smoothly. "It's worked out well for me so far." The gallery was filled beyond capacity with media representatives, legal observers, and members of the public who'd been following the trial, all sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Sketch artists positioned themselves for optimal views, knowing that whatever happened next would become historical record of one of the most unusual murder trials in California history. The case that had already combined elements of corporate intrigue, family betrayal, and scientific murder was about to add another layer. A billionaire defending himself against capital charges with the same confidence he brought to hostile corporate takeovers. Olivia Rodriguez delivered her closing argument first, methodically reviewing the evidence presented over the previous weeks and connecting it into an overwhelming narrative of premeditated murder. She reminded the jury of the three-part motive: financial self-preservation from the embezzlement exposure, corporate control threatened by the trust succession vote, and psychological revenge against brothers who challenged his authority. She walked them through the timeline of Landon's lab access in the middle of the night, his flight to the Hamptons with poison in his luggage, the champagne toast that delivered death to his brothers, and his immediate return to San Diego to control the investigation. Everything about this crime demonstrates planning, calculation, and complete absence of remorse, Olivia told the jury, her voice carrying conviction born from weeks of immersion in the evidence. Landon Fletcher didn't kill his brothers in a moment of passion or during an argument. He synthesized a sophisticated neurotoxin specifically designed to kill them while evading detection. He served them poison while drinking from a separate bottle himself. He watched them die while performing concern for the benefit of his family. And he believed his wealth and intelligence would protect him from consequences. The prosecutor displayed the key pieces of physical evidence one final time: the monogrammed corkscrew with traces of both cork and neurotoxin, the champagne glasses containing Fletcher X-27 residue, the customs documents bearing Landon's signature for precursor chemicals, and most powerfully, photographs from his own murder manual showing him creating the poison in Fletcher Biotech's labs. Olivia reminded the jury of Sterling's courageous testimony and the recorded conversations where Landon had essentially confessed to the murders while attempting to justify them as necessary for protecting his daughter and his company. The defense will argue that this evidence is circumstantial, Olivia concluded. But when every piece of circumstantial evidence points in the same direction, when there's no innocent explanation that accounts for all the facts, circumstantial evidence becomes proof beyond reasonable doubt. Landon Fletcher murdered his brothers. The evidence proves it. Justice demands that you hold him accountable. When Landon rose to deliver his closing argument, he did so with the commanding presence that had made him successful in business, approaching the jury box with notes in hand and an expression of focused intensity. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what the prosecution has presented is a carefully constructed story designed to transform circumstantial evidence and family dysfunction into something that appears to be proof of murder. He began, his voice measured and authoritative. But story is not the same as truth, and suspicion is not the same as certainty. Landon's presentation was articulate and occasionally even compelling, demonstrating the charisma and persuasive skill that had built Fletcher Biotech into a billion-dollar enterprise. He challenged the reliability of lab access records, suggested that the champagne contamination could have occurred through evidence mishandling, and questioned whether the digital documents Sterling had found were actually murder plans or research notes she'd misinterpreted. He addressed his terminal diagnosis directly, arguing that it made no logical sense for him to murder his brothers for control of a company he wouldn't live to run much longer. But as Landon continued his argument, his tone began to shift in ways that suggested his underlying psychology was asserting itself despite his attempts at legal presentation. He moved from challenging evidence to attacking the legitimacy of the prosecution itself, questioning whether the state had the right to judge someone whose contributions to science and medicine had saved countless lives. "The prosecution wants you to focus on 2 deaths, Landon said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there initially. But they ignore the thousands of lives saved by innovations developed under my leadership at Fletcher Biotech. They ignore the economic impact of the company I built, the jobs I created, the charitable contributions I made to this community." It was a disturbing pivot from legal defense to utilitarian argument, suggesting that his contributions somehow balanced against or even exceeded the moral weight of murdering his brothers. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably at this line of reasoning, their expressions suggesting they found the implied claim that he was above normal standards of justice deeply troubling. The decisive turning point in Landon's closing argument came when he addressed Sterling's testimony, his tone shifting from professional to deeply personal in ways that revealed his inability to separate family dynamics from legal strategy. "My daughter Sterling is a brilliant young woman who has been manipulated by investigators eager to build a case at any cost," Landon said, his voice carrying genuine emotion for the first time during the trial. "She found research notes she didn't understand and was pressured into interpreting them in the worst possible light by authorities who saw an opportunity to take down a successful businessman who made them feel inadequate." The accusation was inflammatory and immediately problematic, as it directly challenged Sterling's credibility in ways that invited rebuttal. Olivia Rodriguez stood to object, requesting permission to recall Sterling Fletcher in rebuttal testimony to address these direct attacks on her motivations and understanding. Judge Blackwood, recognizing that Landon had opened the door to additional testimony by challenging his daughter's competence and honesty, granted the request over Landon's objections. The stage was set for what would become the trial's most dramatic confrontation, a father directly cross-examining the daughter who had exposed his crimes. When Sterling returned to the witness stand on March 13th, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. She'd thought her testimony was complete, had been trying to process the trauma of everything she'd experienced, and now faced the prospect of her father directly questioning her about the evidence she'd provided. Landon approached the witness box carrying the documents Sterling had discovered in the cloud storage, his demeanor professional, but his eyes betraying the intensity of emotion beneath the surface. "Sterling, in your previous testimony, you claimed to have found what you characterized as a murder journal in our shared cloud storage," he began, his tone attempting neutrality but carrying undertones of hurt and betrayal. "I'd like to clarify what you actually saw and whether your interpretation was influenced by the investigators who clearly had a predetermined conclusion." Sterling met her father's gaze steadily, her voice remarkably composed given the extraordinary circumstances of being cross-examined by the parent she'd helped prosecute. "What I found was a detailed plan for killing Uncle Donovan and Uncle Joshua using Fletcher X-27, she stated clearly, refusing to allow him to reframe or minimize what she'd discovered. It included timestamps for the Independence Day gathering, notes on how to ensure they both consumed the poisoned champagne, and reminders about bringing your monogrammed corkscrew. There was nothing ambiguous about it. The exchange established a dynamic that would characterize their entire interaction, Landon attempting to control the narrative through precise, leading questions while Sterling maintained factual clarity and emotional honesty despite the pressure. When Landon presented her with printouts of what he claimed were the actual documents she'd found, suggesting they were standard research notes about theoretical compound testing, Sterling's response was devastating in its specificity. The documents included a section literally titled D&J Elimination Timeline, with July 4th specifically marked, Sterling said, her voice gaining strength as she recounted details that made innocent interpretation impossible. "They contained diagrams of the Hamptons' house, showing your position and theirs during the toast. They included a reminder to bring the LWF corkscrew and notes about ensuring the champagne wasn't shared with other family members. There were photographs of you in the lab creating the poison." Each detail she recounted made Landon's suggested reinterpretation increasingly implausible, the specificity of her memory contrasting with his attempts at generalization. The jury watched intently as this extraordinary family confrontation unfolded, a father and daughter engaged in a legal and emotional battle where the stakes included not just Landon's freedom, but their relationship and Sterling's sense of identity and moral clarity. Landon attempted to shift tactics, moving from challenging Sterling's interpretation to questioning her motives for cooperating with investigators. "Sterling, isn't it true that in the months before your uncle's deaths, we had significant disagreements about your spending and lifestyle choices?" he asked, echoing his previous attorney's approach, but with added emotional weight coming directly from her father. The question was designed to suggest that Sterling had turned him in out of resentment or desire for financial independence, but her response silenced the courtroom with its raw honesty and moral clarity. "We argued because I wanted to use some of my trust fund to establish a foundation for addiction recovery services, and you insisted that money should be reinvested in Fletcher Biotech," Sterling said, her voice steady despite visible pain. "The night before I found your murder plans, you told me I was naive for wanting to help people instead of building our legacy. Now I understand exactly what kind of legacy you were creating." The response revealed new dimensions of their relationship while reinforcing Sterling's credibility. She wasn't a resentful daughter rebelling against parental authority, but a young woman who'd been trying to use family resources for social good while her father insisted on corporate investment. The contrast made Landon appear even more focused on control and self-interest, while Sterling emerged as someone guided by genuine values. The most damaging moment of the cross-examination came when Landon, apparently unable to resist the urge to undermine Sterling's credibility through any means available, referenced her sealed juvenile record, the very leverage Donovan had threatened to use. "Given your history of poor judgment," Landon said, his desperation becoming evident, "isn't it possible you've misrepresented what you found to gain independence from my oversight of your finances?" Judge Blackwood immediately intervened, warning Landon about introducing inadmissible evidence, but the damage was done in multiple directions. Sterling's eyes filled with tears for the first time during her testimony, her pain visible as she responded to her father's betrayal. "You just used against me in open court the exact thing you claimed to have killed Uncle Donovan for threatening to reveal," Sterling said, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. "At least now everyone can see exactly who you really are." The gallery erupted in murmurs at this exchange, and several jurors visibly reacted to what they'd just witnessed. Landon claiming he'd murdered to protect his daughter's sealed record, then weaponizing that same record against her when she testified against him. It was a moment of stunning hypocrisy that undermined any claim that his actions had been motivated by paternal protection rather than pure self-interest. Sterling's redirect examination by Olivia Rodriguez was brief but effective, the prosecutor asking only one question. "Miss Fletcher, after everything you've learned and experienced, do you have any doubt that your father poisoned your uncles on July 4th, 2023? Sterling looked directly at Landon as she answered, her voice clear and certain. "None whatsoever. He planned it meticulously, executed it perfectly, and would have gotten away with it if he hadn't accidentally shared his notes with my account. He's brilliant, but arrogant. He never thought anyone would stand against him, especially not me." As Sterling left the witness stand, several jurors nodded slightly at her words, their body language suggesting that her testimony had resonated deeply and that her courage in confronting her father had impressed them far more than Landon's legal maneuvering had persuaded them. The prosecution called additional rebuttal witnesses to reinforce the authentication of the digital evidence and the forensic timeline, and then both sides rested their cases. Judge Blackwood scheduled final jury instructions for March 15th, after which deliberations would begin on charges that could result in Landon Fletcher's execution by the state of California. The trial that had captivated national attention was entering its final phase, but one crucial moment remained: Landon's allocution, his opportunity to address the court before sentencing, where he would deliver the infamous statement that would define his legacy and reveal the full extent of his narcissistic worldview. As the trial moved toward conclusion, Landon appeared increasingly agitated despite his attempts to maintain composure. He believed his intelligence and charisma would allow him to persuade the jury where his attorneys had failed, but the cross-examination of Sterling had backfired spectacularly, making him appear cruel and manipulative rather than misunderstood. His closing argument had veered from legal defense into troubling suggestions that his contributions exempted him from normal moral standards. And most damningly, the recorded conversations played during rebuttal had let the jury hear him describe the murders in coldly utilitarian terms, framing fratricide as a necessary business decision. Olivia Rodriguez felt confident in her case, but remained cautious. Juries were unpredictable, and Landon's wealth and status might generate sympathy despite the evidence. The verdict would ultimately depend on whether 12 ordinary San Diegans could look at one of their city's most prominent citizens and conclude beyond reasonable doubt that he was guilty of the most heinous crime imaginable, murdering his own brothers for money, power, and psychological revenge. The jury instructions took several hours as Judge Blackwood carefully explained the legal standards for first-degree murder, the special circumstances that made the case eligible for the death penalty, and the concept of reasonable doubt that was the foundation of American criminal justice. She emphasized that the jury must find each element of the crimes proven beyond reasonable doubt, that they should carefully evaluate all evidence, including both physical and testimonial proof, and that they must set aside any sympathies or prejudices in reaching their verdict. The 12 jurors and 4 alternates listened intently, taking notes and asking occasional clarifying questions that suggested they understood the gravity of their responsibility. At 3:42 p.m. on March 16, 2024, the case was officially submitted to the jury, who retired to begin deliberations on whether Landon Whitmore Fletcher should be convicted of murdering his brothers and potentially sentenced to death for those crimes. The media encampment around the San Diego County Courthouse grew larger as hours turned to days, with speculation running rampant about what was happening inside the sealed deliberation room. Legal analysts debated whether the jury's extended deliberations suggested disagreement among jurors or simply reflected the massive amount of evidence they needed to review carefully. But inside the deliberation room, the reality was quite different from what observers imagined. The jury had actually reached consensus on Landon's guilt very quickly. The combination of physical evidence, Sterling's testimony, the recorded conversations, and Landon's own behavior during the trial had convinced all 12 jurors beyond reasonable doubt that he'd murdered his brothers with premeditation and calculation. The time they were spending deliberating was mostly focused on reviewing evidence related to special circumstances that would determine whether Landon faced life imprisonment or death, and ensuring they documented their reasoning sufficiently to withstand inevitable appeals. After just 97 minutes of actual deliberation spread across 2 days to review all exhibits thoroughly, the jury notified Judge Blackwood they'd reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed when proceedings reconvened on March 18th, with every seat filled and overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent courtrooms. Landon sat at the defense table alone, having dismissed his legal team weeks earlier, his posture straight and his expression controlled despite what was about to be announced. Sterling sat in the front row beside her grandmother Marissa, who'd insisted on attending despite her deteriorating health from terminal cancer. Detective Sarah Chun was present, as was District Attorney Olivia Rodriguez and her entire prosecution team, everyone sensing the historical significance of this moment. Judge Blackwood called the court to order and asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The forewoman, a retired school teacher who'd taken her responsibilities seriously throughout the trial, stood to announce their decision. On the count of first-degree murder of Donovan Pierce Fletcher, we find the defendant, Landon Whitmore Fletcher, guilty, she stated, her voice steady and clear. On the count of first-degree murder of Joshua Reed Fletcher, we find the defendant, Landon Whitmore Fletcher, guilty. The courtroom erupted in reactions, gasps, murmurs, a few scattered sounds that might have been relief or vindication. Judge Blackwood quickly restored order as the forewoman continued through the special circumstances findings: murder for financial gain, multiple murders, murder by poison, and murder with exceptional planning and sophistication. The jury affirmed each aggravating factor unanimously, making the case eligible for capital punishment. Throughout the reading of the verdict, Landon's expression remained remarkably impassive, his gaze focused on some middle distance, as if the proceedings concerned someone else entirely. He showed neither surprise nor remorse, no visible emotional reaction to being convicted of murdering his own brothers, maintaining the controlled facade he'd presented throughout the trial. The sentencing phase began immediately, with testimony focused on whether Landon Fletcher should receive the death penalty or life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The prosecution presented devastating victim impact statements from Donovan's widow, Catherine, and their children, who described the irreparable loss created by Landon's actions. "My children ask me why their uncle murdered their father," Catherine testified, her voice breaking with grief. "What do I tell them? That he did it for money? For power? How do I help them understand that level of evil from someone who was supposed to be family?" Joshua's fiancée, Maria, followed, describing the future that had been stolen from them, the wedding that would never happen, the life they'd planned that Landon had destroyed with calculated precision. Colleagues from Fletcher Biotech testified about the professional and personal void created by the brothers' deaths, and Olivia Rodriguez tied it all together by emphasizing the calculated nature of the crimes and Landon's complete absence of remorse. The defense presentation during sentencing focused primarily on Landon's contributions to medical research and the cancer patients whose lives had been saved by Fletcher Biotech technologies. With his legal team dismissed, Landon called witnesses who testified to scientific breakthroughs that might be delayed if his remaining months were spent on death row rather than in some kind of supervised research capacity. Dr. Michael Torres, Fletcher Biotech's acting CEO, explained that several promising treatments were in final development stages, their progress potentially affected by Landon's complete removal from the company. It was a utilitarian argument that society would benefit more from allowing Landon limited freedom in his final months than from applying the death penalty. But it seemed tone-deaf given the brutality of his crimes and his lack of remorse. The jury's expressions suggested they weren't persuaded that Landon's scientific contributions outweighed the moral weight of fratricide committed for financial gain and psychological revenge. Sterling Fletcher made the stunning decision to testify during the sentencing phase, approaching the prosecution about her desire to address both the jury and her father directly one final time. Her testimony began with a powerful rejection of Landon's utilitarian arguments. My father has justified everything, his financial crimes, his manipulation, and ultimately murder, by pointing to the greater good of his work. But he's asking you to apply a calculation he never applied himself. He didn't weigh the value of my uncle's lives against his goals. He simply eliminated them when they became obstacles. Sterling described the brothers Landon had murdered in humanizing terms that went beyond their corporate roles. Donovan's mentorship of young executives, Joshua's dedication to ethical research practices, the genuine good they'd contributed that was now permanently lost. She revealed that Landon had been in contact with a true crime podcaster months before the murders, sharing details about theoretical perfect murders that closely mirrored what he would eventually do, suggesting he wasn't just planning to kill his brothers, but planning his infamy, creating his legacy as the brilliant mind who committed an unprecedented crime. Sterling's most powerful moment came when Judge Blackwood permitted her to directly address her father, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances of the case. Dad, I know you see yourself as the hero of this story, the brilliant mind unfairly persecuted, the visionary protecting his legacy, Sterling said, looking directly at Landon for the first time since her earlier testimony. But that's not who you are. You're the man who poisoned his brothers while looking them in the eye, who tried to use my juvenile record against me in court after claiming to have killed to protect it, who values his ego and control above everyone and everything else. Whatever good has come from Fletcher Biotech happened despite your character, not because of it. And whatever research continues will do so without you, led by people with the brilliance you have, but the humanity you lack. The courtroom remained absolutely silent as she finished, several jurors visibly moved by her statement. The contrast between Sterling's moral clarity and Landon's calculated self-interest creating a powerful final impression before deliberations on sentencing. Landon exercised his right to make a personal statement before sentencing, rising to address the court without notes. His demeanor controlled, but with an intensity suggesting this would be his final opportunity to assert his worldview publicly. You've heard much about my crimes, but little about my contributions, he began, outlining Fletcher Biotech's growth under his leadership and the thousands of jobs created. But as his statement continued, the businessman mask began to slip, revealing the underlying narcissism and contempt that had enabled fratricide. My brothers were short-sighted, prioritizing perception over progress, popularity over innovation, Landon said, his tone hardening. They would have destroyed what I built, diluted our impact with feel-good initiatives and regulatory compliance that served no purpose beyond appeasing critics. This unguarded revelation of the contempt that had motivated the murders undermined his appeal for leniency, confirming the prosecution's characterization of his psychology and making clear that he viewed his brother's deaths as justified rather than regrettable. The jury returned with their sentencing recommendation on April 10th after 97 minutes of deliberation, the same duration as their guilt phase verdict, which observers noted might be intentionally symbolic. They unanimously recommended death, citing the calculated nature of the murders, the family betrayal, the financial motivation, and the complete absence of genuine mitigating factors. Judge Blackwood scheduled formal sentencing for April 18th, giving both sides time for final motions and victim statements. During that interim week, disturbing revelations emerged about Landon's behavior while in custody. He'd been recording his conversations with legal visitors, apparently accumulating material for a posthumous memoir tentatively titled The Last Fletcher: Genius, Justice, and Legacy. Notes recovered from his cell detailed plans to release these recordings after his death, portraying himself as a visionary persecuted by an envious system, attempting to control his narrative even from beyond the grave. This discovery provided final confirmation of what Sterling had testified about: his pursuit of infamy as a twisted form of immortality when biological life was no longer possible. April 18th, 2024, arrived with San Diego preparing for the formal sentencing that would conclude legal proceedings in the Fletcher case. The courthouse was surrounded by media, protesters, and security managing the unprecedented public interest. Judge Blackwood entered at precisely 10 a.m. and began with victim impact statements. The cumulative weight of grief expressed by Donovan's widow, Joshua's fiancée, and colleagues created a powerful reminder of the human cost of Landon's crimes. Olivia Rodriguez presented the prosecution's final argument for upholding the death penalty recommendation, emphasizing how Landon had abused every privilege: his education, his resources, his family position, to commit calculated murder for personal gain. The defendant murdered his brothers with scientific precision, using his brilliance to develop an undetectable poison rather than to advance medicine as his company claimed to do, Olivia argued. He showed no remorse, attacked his daughter's credibility when she testified truthfully, and even now seeks to control his narrative through planned posthumous releases. Justice demands the ultimate punishment. When Judge Blackwood offered Landon the opportunity to make a final statement before formal sentencing, what followed would become one of the most infamous courtroom speeches in recent legal history. Landon rose slowly, buttoning his Tom Ford suit jacket in a deliberate gesture reminiscent of his corporate presentations, taking time to survey the courtroom before speaking. "Your Honor, I've listened to these statements about loss and grief with interest, though I find them largely theatrical and designed for media consumption rather than genuine expression," he began, his tone conversational but carrying an edge that suggested what was coming would be unlike typical allocution. "What no one in this room seems to grasp, perhaps with the exception of my daughter who understands me better than she might wish to, is that this entire proceeding has unfolded precisely as I anticipated and to a large extent orchestrated." The opening statement created immediate tension, and Judge Blackwood leaned forward, perhaps already sensing that Landon was about to say something that would require intervention or become grounds for additional legal action. "Let me be perfectly clear about several facts that seem to have eluded this court," Landon continued, his voice gaining strength and authority. "Fletcher Biotech exists because I built it. San Diego's medical research sector exists because I funded it. And Your Honor's judicial career exists because I financed your last campaign through channels designed specifically to avoid public disclosure requirements." The courtroom erupted at this statement, forcing Judge Blackwood to call for order, her expression carefully controlled as Landon directly alleged a conflict of interest that, if true, would call into question the entire proceedings. Once silence was restored, Landon continued without waiting for permission, his statement becoming the performance Sterling had testified he'd been planning since before the murders themselves. "You're a tenant in my city," Landon declared, his voice carrying effortlessly through the now silent courtroom. "I own the ground this courthouse floats on through subsidiary holding companies that manage the municipal bonds that financed its construction. My tax contributions fund the salaries of everyone from the bailiffs to Your Honor herself." The naked arrogance of this statement left many observers stunned, the defendant using his final court appearance not for remorse or mitigation, but for declaration of perceived superiority that transcended legal accountability. Landon turned to face the families of his victims, breaking courtroom protocol in a final assertion of his refusal to acknowledge conventional authority. "Donovan and Joshua were necessary sacrifices to preserve what I built, what our father built before them," he said coldly. "They would have dismantled Fletcher Biotech's most profitable research divisions, redirected resources to fashionable but ultimately meaningless ethical initiatives, and destroyed the company's value through transparency measures that would have revealed classified government contracts. The utilitarian framing of fratricide as business necessity revealed the fundamental difference in his moral framework. Human lives evaluated primarily as assets or obstacles to organizational objectives rather than possessing inherent value. Judge Blackwood interrupted, warning that his statement was moving beyond appropriate bounds and potentially constituting new testimony requiring cross-examination. But Landon merely smiled and continued. "What you fail to understand, Your Honor, is that men like me, who create rather than merely adjudicate, who build rather than merely critique, operate by different rules because we deliver different value," he said, the naked expression of superiority so profound it had enabled fratricide without apparent moral conflict. "I don't expect justice from this court because justice would recognize my contributions against my alleged crimes. What I expect is the predictable reaction of a system designed to preserve itself against those who transcend its limitations." As security officers moved closer in response to Judge Blackwood's subtle signal, Landon delivered his final and most infamous declaration. "I run this city. I created the economy you all depend upon. I funded the medical center that will treat your children's illnesses. I established the foundation that supports your cultural institutions. When you sentence me today, remember that you're not removing a criminal from society. You're sacrificing your benefactor to satisfy public bloodlust and media narratives." The statement, delivered with absolute conviction rather than theatrical bravado, revealed the fundamental worldview that had enabled Landon to poison his brothers. A genuine belief in his exemption from conventional morality based on his contributions and capabilities, a perspective that placed him above rather than within the social contract governing ordinary citizens. Judge Blackwood allowed several moments of silence following this extraordinary statement before responding, her expression unreadable as she appeared to consider how to address what constituted not just absence of remorse, but explicit rejection of the court's legitimacy. When she finally spoke, her voice carried institutional rather than personal authority. "Mr. Fletcher, your remarks have been noted for the record. Before I proceed with sentencing, I am obligated to address the allegation you've made regarding campaign contributions to my judicial election." The courtroom tensed, uncertain whether they were witnessing judicial misconduct being exposed or a final manipulation by a defendant with nothing to lose. "Court records will show that on March 30th of this year, I instructed the district attorney's office to investigate anonymous donations to my campaign committee from 2021, having received information suggesting these funds might be traced to Fletcher Biotech subsidiaries," Judge Blackwood stated, referring to documents immediately distributed to court officers and prosecution. "These investigations confirmed your indirect financial support of my campaign, a matter I disclosed to the Judicial Ethics Committee while requesting guidance on recusal requirements given the advanced stage of proceedings." Her prepared response suggested she'd anticipated Landon's revelation, perhaps warned by discovery of his recorded conversations and planned posthumous memoir, her procedural caution preventing what he'd clearly intended as a disruptive revelation that would undermine the legitimacy of his conviction. Judge Blackwood explained that she would proceed with sentencing as scheduled based on Ethics Committee guidance, but would recuse herself from all post-sentencing proceedings, effectively neutralizing Landon's attempt to create a procedural crisis while addressing the ethical concern transparently. "Landon Whitmore Fletcher, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances." Judge Blackwood began formal sentencing, her tone shifting to the solemn formality appropriate to the gravity of the crimes and punishment. "The jury has recommended the death penalty, finding that aggravating factors substantially outweigh any mitigating factors. Having reviewed all evidence, victim statements, and your own remarks to this court, I find no reason to depart from their determination. Accordingly, it is the sentence of this court that you shall be put to death in the manner prescribed by the laws of the state of California." As sentence was formally pronounced, Landon's expression remained unchanged, his posture still commanding, his eyes focused on Judge Blackwood with what observers described as calculation rather than fear or acceptance. When asked if he understood the sentence, he responded simply, "Perfectly, Your Honor. Perhaps better than you do." a final subtle challenge reflecting his continued belief in his ability to control the narrative even in defeat. Landon was transferred to San Quentin State Prison later that day, beginning what was expected to be a brief residence on death row given his terminal cancer diagnosis. Medical evaluations confirmed he had perhaps 3 months remaining, rendering the formal death sentence largely symbolic. Cancer would accomplish what state execution wouldn't have time to implement. For Landon, this medical reality represented a final loss of control. His death would come not through dramatic state execution he'd apparently anticipated as culmination of his infamy narrative, but through mundane biological process indistinguishable from thousands of other cancer deaths. On June 15, 2024, less than 2 months after sentencing, Landon Whitmore Fletcher was found unresponsive in his cell, his death confirmed at 6:43 a.m. Official cause was complications from pancreatic cancer, though toxicology revealed elevated morphine levels suggesting he'd accumulated prescribed pain medication for a final deliberate overdose, a last assertion of control over timing and manner of his death. The legal aftermath included civil proceedings against Landon's estate by victims' families and shareholders, complicated by elaborate estate planning designed to shield assets from such claims. Detective Sarah Chun was reassigned to investigating the network of shell companies Landon had established, financial structures that mirrored the neurotoxin's complexity, both designed to achieve specific outcomes while evading detection. These investigations eventually recovered substantial assets for victim compensation, though Landon's financial engineering had successfully shielded significant portions of his wealth. Marissa Caldwell Fletcher outlived her eldest son by just 17 days, passing peacefully on July 2, 2024, almost exactly 1 year after the text exchange that had triggered the murders. Her death marked the end of the original Fletcher generation, leaving Sterling as sole direct inheritor of both family legacy and the moral burden of redirecting it away from her father's crimes. On July 15, 2024, Sterling Fletcher presided over the formal launch of the Donovan and Joshua Fletcher Foundation at a ceremony held in the Fletcher wing of San Diego's University Medical Center. Her first substantial public appearance since testifying, the 19-year-old demonstrated remarkable poise as she outlined the foundation's mission supporting whistleblower protections, ethical oversight in biotechnology, and educational initiatives promoting scientific integrity. My uncles believe that innovation without ethics is not progress, but danger, a principle my father rejected at terrible cost, Sterling stated, her candid acknowledgement of family history setting the tone for an organization committed to transparency and accountability rather than secretive control. The foundation's work represented Sterling's answer to her father's legacy, neither denial nor rejection, but transformation, acknowledging the brilliance that created Fletcher Biotech, while redirecting its application toward ethical rather than expedient ends. The Fletcher case continued to generate public fascination through true crime podcasts and documentaries, including the controversial series, The Fletcher Files, that incorporated Landon's posthumously released materials alongside critical analysis from psychologists and ethicists. The series became 2024's most downloaded podcast, reflecting cultural fascination with the intersection of genius, wealth, and moral corruption that Landon embodied. For San Diego, the case prompted difficult conversations about the relationship between private wealth and public institutions, conversations that continued to shape policy throughout the region. Sterling's foundation and the reformed Fletcher Biotech established new models for corporate ethics and scientific responsibility, physical and organizational changes reflecting deeper transformation in governance and accountability. The Fletcher name, which Landon claimed owned the ground the courthouse floats on, became instead associated with whistleblower protection and ethical innovation, a legacy transformation that Sterling described as reclaiming our family's contribution from the distortion my father created. As years passed, Sterling Fletcher continued her work transforming family tragedy into systemic improvement through programs that addressed the cultural worship of brilliant jerks that had allowed Landon to justify moral exemptions based on intellectual contribution. The foundation supported dozens of researchers and advocates working to ensure scientific advancement served humanity rather than threatened it. Modest but meaningful successes that would likely occupy decades of patient effort. In her private journal, Sterling wrote a reflection that captured her understanding of her role. My father believed his brilliance entitled him to different rules. My uncles understood that true brilliance includes moral imagination. Their perspective is the true Fletcher legacy and the one I choose to advance. The foundation bearing their names can't undo what happened, but it can ensure their values rather than their murderers define our family's ultimate contribution. The story of Landon Whitmore Fletcher, billionaire, murderer, narcissist, and the man who claimed, "I run this city," became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of accountability regardless of wealth or status. His infamous courtroom statement revealed a worldview so fundamentally disconnected from normal human morality that it shocked even hardened legal observers. But the more important story might be Sterling's. The 19-year-old who found her father's murder plans, chose justice over family loyalty despite enormous personal cost, and dedicated her inheritance to ensuring that brilliance would be guided by ethics rather than ego. Her courage transformed a story of calculated evil into one about the possibility of redemption, not for the murderer who never sought it, but for a family name and the resources it commanded. In the end, Landon Fletcher didn't run San Diego. He was judged by it, convicted by it, and sentenced to death by it, proving that even billionaires who poison their brothers must ultimately answer to justice. And his daughter ensured that his final legacy wouldn't be the murders he committed or the arrogant declaration he made, but the ethical foundation she built from the ruins of his crimes, using his wealth to advance the values he'd rejected, transforming destruction into healing one grant, one program, one life at a time.